Hercule Poirot and the Man Who Smiled Before He Died. Chapter 1. The Smile in the Library. It was the kind of party where everyone laughed too loudly, drank too little, and watched each other too closely. At the sprawling country estate of Sir Everard, Vale, the atmosphere crackled with tension beneath a facade of genteel civility. The chandelier's light shimmered off champagne flutes, and the ticking of an antique long-case clock marked time like the drumbeat of a silent threat. The guests had gathered for what was advertised as a weekend of leisure, a modest affair compared to the grand events of earlier seasons. Sir Everard, once a lion of the city, and now a celebrated patron of the arts, had recently turned 70 and was rumored to be preparing changes to his famously complicated will. That alone might have brought tension to the gathering, but there were other undercurrents, hushed quarrels, jealous glances, and one guest whose very presence had unsettled the balance. Lucian Drake Tall, silver-templed and too charming by half, Drake had arrived with a dazzling smile and a reputation for bringing ruin where he tread. He had once been engaged to Everard's only daughter, Julia Vale, before their very public and very bitter breakup. That he had returned, uninvited but somehow accepted, set off a quiet panic among the more conservative guests. No one knew what he wanted, and Lucian, of course, had refused to say. It was Julia who found the body. The evening had wound down into small talk and piano music. Guests retired in waves to their rooms, claiming fatigue or headaches. Julia had gone to the library in search of a particular volume, her father's first edition of the Confessions of Rousseau, when she stopped dead in the doorway. Lucian Drake was seated in the leather wingback chair by the hearth, his legs crossed, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow. At first glance he seemed simply to be resting. Then Julia saw it. The thin trickle of blood on his temple, the unnatural tilt of his head, and the smile. He was smiling. That, more than the blood or the stillness, sent a chill through her bones. By the time the others arrived, drawn by her scream, Lucian Drake was indisputably dead. No weapon was found. The windows were locked from the inside. No signs of a struggle. A book lay open in his lap, The Art of War, in French. And still that same terrible smile on his face, as if the last thing he had seen had amused him immensely. Everard, white-faced and trembling, stood staring at the body of the man he had once called a vulture in a waistcoat. Julia clutched a silk handkerchief to her mouth as the guests gathered like shadows in the doorway. And somewhere upstairs, the old grandfather clock chimed midnight. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The following morning dawned with a pale, anemic light that crept hesitantly through the fog surrounding Thornway Hall. The frost clung to the windows, as if reluctant to release the house from the grip of the previous night's horror. Inside, the mood was subdued. The body of Lucian Drake had been removed under the cautious supervision of the local constable, though no one had dared tidy the library. It stood sealed, a tomb of unanswered questions. At the breakfast table, few ate. Tea was sipped without enthusiasm, toast left untouched. Julia Vale sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes bloodshot and fixed somewhere far away. Her father, Sir Everard, had aged in the night. He looked every minute of his 70 years, and then some. His normally commanding presence had withered into something brittle. His tremor, which he normally disguised with clever posture, was now impossible to miss. It was just after 10 o'clock when the butler, Merton, entered the dining room with a telegram on a silver tray. He cleared his throat delicately and approached. "Sir Everard, sir," he said, a response from Monsieur Poirot. Sir Everard took the envelope with a kind of reverence. The other guests leaned in, though none dared speak. He slit it open and read quickly. "Well?" asked Lady Halbert, who had no patience for suspense. "He is on his way," said Sir Everard, folding the note with trembling fingers. "By motor car from London. He will be here before noon." A collective breath was held and released. Even in the face of something as unfathomable as murder, the name Hercule Poirot brought a strange reassurance. Though foreign in manner and style, the great detective's reputation preceded him even in the cold halls of English nobility. By 11:45, Poirot's arrival was as dignified and deliberate as one would expect. He emerged from a dark touring car with polished spats and a faint scent of cologne. Despite the cold, his overcoat was impeccably pressed. His mustache waxed to perfection, and his hat angled just so. He paused at the grand entrance to Thornway Hall and surveyed it with interest, then nodded once precisely. "I do not like fog," he murmured to himself in his accented English. "It is a deceiver, n'est-ce pas? Everything soft, vague, no clarity. It hides the truth." Merton bowed and led him into the drawing-room, where the remaining guests had gathered like penitents awaiting judgment. Poirot made his way inside with a calm grace, removing his gloves as he scanned the faces before him. Sir Everard stepped forward. "Monsieur Poirot, I cannot thank you enough for coming on such short notice." Poirot gave a courteous bow. "But, of course, it is always the duty of Hercule Poirot to aid where the truth is obscured, especially in cases so—" He paused, choosing his word carefully. Curieux, he turned to face the others. "I ask for a small indulgence. I would like to speak with each of you in turn. But first, I must understand who you are." Sir Everard gestured toward the group. "Of course. Everyone here was present last night." Poirot stepped forward, addressing the room. "You must forgive me, Eves," said gently, "but I am a man of order. I require things to be laid out with precision. Names, relationships, the facts before the feelings. We?" There was a polite murmur of agreement. Poirot gestured toward the youngest among them, a slight man with spectacles and a scholarly air. "You, monsieur?" "Dr. Felix Linton," the man said. "I am a historian, a guest of Sir Everard's, doing some research on his personal archives." Poirot nodded. "Merci." "And you, madame?" "Lady Margaret Halbert," came the crisp reply from a matronly woman in pearls and a steel expression. "Sir Everard and I have been friends for many years. I was a bridesmaid at his first wedding." Poirot turned to a man with a dashing demeanor, his suit rumpled and his expression guarded. "Colonel Geoffrey Standish," he said tersely. "I served with Sir Everard in India. We've stayed in touch." "Miss Vale, I presume?" Poirot asked gently, turning to Julia. She nodded silently. "And this gentleman?" The man seated beside Julia rose. He was of medium height, with a sallow complexion and a permanent squint. "Douglas Thane. I'm Miss Vale's fiancé," he said, his tone faintly defensive. Poirot gave a slight bow. "And finally, the staff." Sir Everard responded, "You'll find only 3 under this roof aside from myself and the guests: Merton, the butler, Miss Linley, my housekeeper, and Fenwick, the gardener, though he does not stay in the house." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Très bien. I shall begin with Miss Vale." Interview 1. Julia Vale Poirot and Julia sat alone in the morning-room, which looked out upon the mist-covered gardens. Julia had composed herself somewhat, though her eyes still shimmered with unspent tears. "I need to ask you to recall last night," Poirot said gently. Everything, mademoiselle, however small. Julia exhaled, nodding. I went to the library to find a book, my father's first edition of Rousseau. I thought it would help me sleep. I opened the door and saw Lucien in the chair. At first I thought he was only resting. You had spoken to him earlier, briefly? He was, as he always was, insufferably confident. He said he'd come to make peace. I didn't believe him. Was he invited? She hesitated. No, he just showed up. But father didn't want a scene. He let him stay. Poirot nodded slowly. And how did your fiancé feel about this? Her lips tightened. Douglas was furious. He never liked Lucien. No one did. Was anyone close with Mr. Drake? Poirot asked. Julia paused. Lady Halberd used to admire him. I don't know why. She said he reminded her of someone from her youth, and Felix, Dr. Linton, seemed fascinated by him. But I'm not sure it was admiration. More like observation. Poirot's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Observation? That is curious. Interview 2. Colonel Standish. Standish sat stiffly, arms folded. I had no time for Drake, he said gruffly. He was a cad. God knows why Everard let him through the front door. Did you speak with him? Briefly. He was sniffing around, trying to stir things up. Said something about unfinished business. Sounded like a threat. Poirot tilted his head. And where were you when the body was discovered? In my room. Reading. Heard the scream and came down. Alone. Yes. Poirot nodded once. Merci. Interview 3. Lady Halberd gave Poirot a long, appraising look. You think I killed him? She asked coolly. Poirot smiled faintly. I think nothing, madame. I observe. I question, she sniffed. Lucien was a bore. Pretty, too. Look at, but all ego. I enjoyed our debates, that's all. He liked to shock. Shock how? He hinted that he knew things. Secrets. He was fond of saying that everyone at Thornway Hall had something to hide, including Sir Everard. Poirot filed that away. And you, madam? What is it you hide? She smiled thinly. Nothing you'd be clever enough to find. Interview 4. Dr. Felix Linton. Felix Linton wrung his hands nervously. This is a dreadful situation, Monsieur Poirot. Dreadful. You knew the deceased. Barely. I only met him yesterday. But I was fascinated. The way he spoke, like a man who sees more than he says. He was studying people. Studying? Yes. I got the sense he was provoking everyone deliberately. Setting little traps. He even said to me, people reveal themselves in anger, doctor, or in fear. I wrote that down in my notebook. Poirot's eyes sharpened. You took notes? Well, yes. I observe behavior. It's part of my research. Poirot leaned forward. Did he speak of your research? He hinted that he'd read some of it, which was odd. My work isn't published. Not yet. Then how did he know? I don't know. Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then would you show me your notebook? Felix hesitated. I'll find it. Interview 5. Douglas Thane. Douglas Thane was a man perpetually on edge, and today he looked positively brittle. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're getting at, he said at once. Poirot raised a brow. I have not accused you. No, but you're thinking it. I hated the bastard. He hurt Julia. He humiliated her. If I'd had the chance, I might have given him a black eye. But murder? That's different. Where were you last night at midnight? In the drawing room, alone, after Julia went upstairs. I needed air. Poirot gave a slow nod. Très bien. Thank you, monsieur. When the interviews concluded, Poirot asked to see the library himself. Sir Everard unlocked the door with an air of dread. The room was untouched. Poirot moved with quiet reverence, observing every detail. The open book in the dead man's lap, the untouched brandy, the angle of the chair, the window latches, the hearth. He knelt beside the fireplace, inspecting the grate. A faint scent lingered. Burnt paper? He turned suddenly. "Monsieur," he said to Sir Everard, "you spoke of changes to your will?" Sir Everard's eyes flickered. "Yes, I was planning to revise it. I never got the chance. Did Mr. Drake know of this intent?" Sir Everard hesitated. He might have. He had a way of learning things. Poirot gave a small, unreadable smile. "Ah, then we must consider. If he knew something he should not, might that knowledge have cost him his life?" Sir Everard said nothing. Poirot stepped forward, picked up the book from the chair, and turned to the page Lucien Drake had supposedly been reading. A line was underlined, in pencil. Poirot read it aloud. "To appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak, that is the art of war." He closed the book. "Murder," Poirot whispered, "is never simple, but it is always personal." Chapter 3. Ashes and Echoes. The line underlined in Lucien Drake's book read, "The man who smiles too often has secrets that are buried deep." Poirot studied it in silence, the book held gently in his gloved hands, as though it might whisper truths if treated with enough care. Sir Everard hovered nearby, watching the detective with growing unease. "This book," Poirot murmured, "was not chosen at random, nor is this line underlined by accident. No, no, it is the kind of message left by a man who knows his end is near, or suspects it may be." "But Lucien couldn't have known," Sir Everard objected. "He was arrogant, to the point of delusion. He would never have believed he was in danger." Poirot closed the volume with a soft thump. Perhaps not, or perhaps he knew precisely the kind of hornet's nest he had stirred. He turned to the fireplace once more. The scent of burnt paper had not faded. Poirot knelt, producing a pair of small silver tongs from his pocket. Delicately, he extracted a blackened scrap from between the coals. Sir Everard leaned in. "What is that?" "A remnant of correspondence, I believe." Poirot examined the fragment. Only part of a sentence remained, half-scorched. "Cannot keep silent forever. If you don't, consequences will be dire." Sir Everard blanched. "Good God!" Poirot rose. "We must speak with your staff, especially the housekeeper and the butler, Merton. They see much and speak little, n'est-ce pas?" Sir Everard nodded grimly. "As you wish. I'll have Merton send Miss Linley. To you, interview 6. Miss Linley, housekeeper." Miss Linley was a tall woman of perhaps 60, with a pinched mouth and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her uniform was pristine, her posture rigid. Poirot observed her as she entered the morning room, sat at his invitation. "Madame," he began gently, "how long have you been in the service of Thornway Hall?" 24 years, sir," she said crisply. "Then you know its inhabitants well. I know their habits, their preferences, their tempers." Poirot nodded. "Were you aware of any quarrels between Mr. Drake and the others?" She hesitated. He was not a popular man. "Who disliked him the most?" "Miss Vale." Understandably. Colonel Standish didn't hide his contempt. Mr. Thane seemed ready to come to blows with him by dinner, and I dare say Lady Halberd was more enamored with Mr. Drake's mystery than his manners. Poirot tilted his head. "Did he seem fearful last night?" "No, sir. Quite the opposite. He seemed amused. as though he were playing a game the rest of us didn't understand. Did he go out after dinner? Miss Linley shook her head. He remained in the library from shortly after 9 until his death. Poirot raised a brow. You are certain? Took him a glass of brandy at 9:30. He asked to be left undisturbed. He was reading. Poirot held up the underlined book. This? Yes, sir. That one. Poirot leaned forward. And where was everyone else? After dinner, most guests retired to their rooms. Mr. Thane and Colonel Standish went to the drawing-room for drinks. Lady Halberd played piano in the music-room. Dr. Linton stayed in the study with his notebook. Ah, Poirot said softly, a house of silence, and yet a man ends up dead in the next room. Miss Linley's expression flickered for a moment. Poirot caught it. There is something you are not saying, no? She hesitated then. Saw someone slip out into the garden around 11 through the east corridor. I thought it strange at the time. Who? I couldn't say. It was dark, but the figure moved quickly, purposefully. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Très intéressant. Merci, madame. Interview 7. Merton, butler. Merton stood at attention, hands clasped behind his back. A man of few words, his age and posture bespoke a life of discipline. Merton, Poirot said, you were present last night when the guests retired. Yes, sir. I extinguished the lamps just before midnight. Did you see Mr. Drake after dinner? Only briefly. He remained in the library. Did he speak to anyone? Make any phone calls? Not to my knowledge. Poirot steepled, his fingers. And tell me, Merton, is there any hidden way to leave the library? Merton's brow furrowed. You mean secret passages? Poirot gave a mild shrug. Old houses have their secrets, do they not? There is no secret door, but the library has a side entrance that leads to the garden, locked from the inside. Poirot perked up. Was it locked when the body was discovered? I believe so, sir. But you did not check. No, sir. Poirot gave a slight nod. That will be all for now. After the interviews, Poirot took a long walk through the estate, grounds. The garden path was damp with frost, and the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing twisted hedges and skeletal trees. Near the eastern corridor, he paused and bent low. There, in the soil beneath a bay window, were faint impressions, footprints. Examined them closely, one set, smaller than average light tread, and nearby, something glittered in the soil. A cufflink. Poirot picked it up delicately with his handkerchief. It was gold, monogrammed, not initials, but a symbol, a coiled serpent. He stared at it for a long moment, then he smiled faintly. A serpent sheds its skin to grow, but sometimes it leaves behind more than it intended. That afternoon, a revelation Poirot requested that all the guests reconvene in the drawing-room. They arrived one by one, uneasy under his scrutiny. He stood by the hearth, the cufflink hidden in his pocket, his expression unreadable. I thank you all for your cooperation, he began. I now believe I understand more than I did this morning. A picture begins to form, though some brushstrokes remain incomplete. There was a rustle of discomfort. Poirot continued. I have 2 questions. Firstly, who among you entered the garden last night near 11? No one spoke. Poirot's eyes swept the room. No one? Then I must assume the figure I saw in the mud, who left behind a very specific cufflink, has a reason to remain silent. Julia Vale stood abruptly. A cufflink. Whose? Poirot held up the item. Perhaps the person will volunteer before I make inquiries into each guest's wardrobe. Douglas Thane paled. I've never seen that before. Of course you have, Colonel Standish snapped suddenly. You wore that set at the club last month. Thane spun toward him. "That's a lie." Poirot's eyebrows lifted, but he said nothing. Julia turned to her fiancé. "Douglas, is it yours?" He looked away. "I lost one, some time ago." Poirot nodded. "Ah, the truth leaks out like a cracked teacup, yes?" Thane clenched his fists. "I didn't kill him. I only went out for air. He saw me in the library and made some crude comment. I told him to go to hell and walked out to the rose path." Poirot stepped forward. "And what did he say?" "He said, 'You can marry her, but she'll always wonder if it should have been me.'" The silence that followed was heavy. Poirot folded his arms. "So? You were provoked. You left. Yet he ended up dead." Thane growled. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot raised a placating hand. "I accuse no one. I only gather the facts." He turned now to Felix Linton, who had gone pale. "Dr. Linton, did you find your notebook?" The man swallowed. Yes. May I see it?" He handed it over. Poirot flipped through it quickly, stopping at one entry from the night before. 10:44 was since p.m. Lucy and Drake said, "The will is just the surface. What's buried below the ink? That's what matters." Poirot read the line aloud. Everyone stiffened. Sir Everard took a step forward. What did he mean by that? Poirot looked up. "I believe he referred to an older will, one he discovered." "No," Halberd muttered. "Impossible. The only will Everard has is the one his solicitor filed last year." Poirot's eyes sparkled. "Unless, of course, Mr. Drake discovered one written earlier. One that changed everything." He turned to Sir Everard. "Was there ever such a document?" Sir Everard hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, years ago, before Julia was born. It left everything to my brother's line, but that version was destroyed long ago, or so I thought." Poirot's voice was calm. "Then I suggest we search Lucy on Drake's room. If he intended to use an old will to blackmail his way into fortune, he may have hidden it somewhere close." Discovery in the guest room, Poirot led the search personally, and within an hour, a folded parchment was discovered beneath the lining of Drake's suitcase. It was the original will, dated, sealed, and still bearing Sir Everard's signature. Poirot held it up. He had leverage, and he intended to use it. But someone with everything to lose, ensured he never would. The guest stared in silence. Poirot looked at each of them, his gaze piercing. "I now know who killed Lucian Drake," he said softly. "But knowing is not the same as proving." His eyes paused on one face. "I will wait until tomorrow. If the truth is not revealed voluntarily, then I shall reveal it myself." He turned and left at the room. Chapter 4. The Face Behind the Smile. A cold wind swept through Thornway Hall that night, rattling the panes and whistling through the stone corridors. The guests retired early, murmuring among themselves in low, nervous tones. Whispers of secrets, suspicions, and sleepless thoughts hung in the air like fog. In the east wing, Poirot sat by the window in his private room, gazing down at the darkened gardens. The cufflink lay on the table beside him, along with the old will, now sealed in an envelope marked Evidence. On a notepad before him, he had sketched a diagram of the manor. Rooms, passages, timelines, movements, the mystery was tightening, and Poirot could feel the pressure building. But as always, he waited. For people, if watched closely enough, will reveal themselves the morning confession. That wasn't at breakfast. All the guests were subdued. Only Poirot remained composed, sipping his hot chocolate with evident pleasure. The others picked at their food, and glances darted like startled birds. At precisely 9 o'clock, Colonel Standish stood abruptly. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice clipped. "Might I have a word, in private?" Poirot nodded and followed him to the study. Once the door closed, the colonel turned, jaw tight. "I'll speak plainly. I believe Drake was going to expose something about my time in India. There were rumors about a particular mission. Intelligence work? Things that, if made public, would cast doubt on my entire career." Poirot watched him carefully. "Rumors that were true?" The colonel's mouth thinned. "I did what needed to be done. Nothing more." Poirot gave a subtle nod. "But you feared exposure." "Yes, he alluded to it during dinner. A single sentence. Sometimes history hides behind a mustache and a uniform." He smiled as he said it. He always smiled. Poirot folded his hands. "You were in the drawing room after dinner. Did you leave it?" "I stepped out for a moment. Around 10. Went to my room, then back. No more." Poirot arched a brow. "Then you did not go near the library?" "No." Poirot remained silent for a long beat. "Then, if you are innocent, Colonel, do not run from the shadows. They have long memories." The colonel bristled, but said no more. He left the room with stiff shoulders and a clenched jaw. Poirot made a note, the clue in the music room later. That day, Poirot wandered into the music room. Drawn by a melody softly played on the grand piano, Lady Halberd sat at the keys, her fingers brushing the notes with mechanical elegance. The melody was disjointed, troubled. "You play with sadness today, madam?" Poirot said gently. She looked up, startled. "Oh, I didn't hear you enter." Approached slowly. "Forgive me, I did not wish to interrupt. Music can be a confession of the soul, can it not?" She closed the lid softly. "There's too much silence in this house now." Poirot sat across from her. "And yet, I feel you are not unused to silence. You have learned to speak less and observe more." Lady Halberd tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "You saw more than you have said. About Mr. Drake. About the night of his death." Her lips tightened. "I saw him whisper something to Julia Vale in the hallway around 10 o'clock. She looked furious, then frightened. Did you hear what was said?" "No, but he leaned close. Too close." Poirot nodded. "Did you see her afterward?" "Yes. She fled to her room. I heard her crying through the wall." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "You and she share a wall, only at the corner, enough to hear raised voices." Poirot stood. "Merci, Lady Halberd. That is most helpful." As he turned to go, she said quietly, "She's not as fragile as she appears." Poirot paused. "No, but perhaps more cornered than anyone realized." Interview 8 Julia Vale. Poirot found Julia in the conservatory, standing alone among the ferns and orchids, her arms folded tightly around herself. "Miss Vale," he said softly. She turned slowly. Her eyes were red-rimmed but defiant. "I know what you're going to ask," she said. "And yes, Lucien confronted me." Poirot remained silent, letting her speak. "He said he had a letter from my mother, dated before I was born. He said it proved that Everard wasn't my father." Poirot inhaled sharply. "Bonjour," she nodded, hugging herself tighter. "He said he'd expose it unless I called off my engagement to Douglas and convinced Sir Everard to name him heir. And the letter? I never saw it. I stormed away, went to my room and locked the door." Poirot took a step closer. "And you remained there all night?" She looked away. "I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot, but you wanted to. Silence him." Tears welled in her eyes. "If it's true about the letter, then my entire life is a lie. But if it isn't, Then he was just cruel. Poirot studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he left her in the conservatory, surrounded by orchids and pain. Poirot's deduction by late afternoon, Poirot had reviewed all he needed. He requested Merton gather the guests once again in the drawing-room. They arrived, wary and silent. Poirot stood before them, as still and precise as a metronome. He tapped a folded piece of paper in his palm. "The original will, this document," he began, "is the heart of the motive, but not the only one." He looked at Douglas Thane. "You feared losing Julia, and perhaps your status, to Colonel Standish. You feared disgrace to Dr. Linton. You feared your reputation would be shredded by association with Lucian's schemes to Lady Halbert. You feared his affections, unwanted and perhaps once encouraged, would be exposed. And finally, to Julia. You feared the truth." Silence reigned. Poirot held up the cufflink. "This placed Mr. Thane near the library, but it is not proof of murder, only presence." Poirot then pulled out another item. A folded paper found hidden inside a violin case in the music room. A second letter, from Julia's mother. It contradicts the first. She was married to Sir Everard before Julia was conceived, which makes the first letter Lucian claimed to possess a forgery. Julia gasped. "He lied?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, he lied, because he intended to force Sir Everard into rewriting his will, and then blackmail each of you using what scraps of information he had." Poirot walked slowly across the room, but he underestimated someone who had far more to lose than the rest. He stopped in front of Felix Linton. "You, Doctor." Linton flinched. "What?" Poirot's voice was calm. "You told us you were in the study all night, but your fingerprints were found on the inside latch of the library's side door." Linton paled. "You and Lucian were once colleagues in Vienna. You funded one of his failed ventures, a pharmaceutical scheme that lost investors millions. When he returned to England, he used that knowledge to extort your silence." Poirot drew out a copy of a wire transfer receipt. "This transfer from your account to one of Lucian's shell companies happened 2 weeks ago." Linton stammered. He said he'd tell the medical board. He said I'd never work again." Poirot's voice grew quiet. "So you waited. You knew the library door could be unlocked from inside. You slipped in, confronted him, and when he refused to give you the documents, you struck him with the fireplace poker." A gasp rippled through the room. Poirot walked to the fireplace, removed the poker from its stand, and showed them the faintest trace of blood near the base. "I imagine you tried to make it look like a fall, but the blow was deliberate." Linton collapsed into the armchair, burying his face in his hands. "I just wanted to stop him. I didn't mean to kill him. I panicked." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Murder is rarely born of cold intent, Doctor. It is fear, wearing the mask of desperation." Epilogue. Inspector Dallimore arrived by evening. Linton was taken into custody quietly, offering no resistance. The will was returned to Sir Everard, who, after much thought, burned both the original and the forged versions. "I won't let a dead man rewrite the past," he said. Julia and Douglas left Thornway Hall, together the next day, their future uncertain but no longer chained to lies. Poirot remained a final night, walking the halls in silence. The library, now empty, still held the scent of smoke and secrets. As he packed his valise, Merton approached with a package. "This arrived for you, sir. No sender's name." Poirot opened it. Inside was a small book, The Nature of Smiles, with a ribbon marking the same underlined quote. On the back page, scribbled in Drake's hand, were the words, If they ever find this, you'll know I knew. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, Mr. Drake, you knew. But knowing, alas, was not enough to save you. Chapter 5. The Widow and the Wound. The autumn mist clung to Thornway Hall like a second skin. With Dr. Felix Linton in custody and the household slowly returning to its routines, a heavy hush had settled. And yet, Poirot, ever the hunter of threads yet untied, remained unsatisfied. "I have solved the murder," he said aloud to himself as he stood before the fire in the drawing-room. Maze, was it the only crime? For there were questions that still prickled the back of his mind. Why did Lucien Drake smile that last evening with such calm certainty? What had he meant by, "You'll know I knew"? And what precisely had he known? Poirot's instincts, as ever, were rarely wrong. Something deeper remained, hidden beneath the surface of justice, already served. A visit from the widow. Halbert. That morning, Poirot requested a final conversation. With Lady Imogen Halbert, the widow of Sir Hugo Halbert, Everard Vale's late cousin, she arrived at the drawing-room with her customary poise, tall, elegant, and dressed in deep violet. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, settling onto a settee with practiced grace. "You asked to see me?" Poirot offered her a cup of tea, which she accepted without hesitation. "Lady Halbert," he said with that famous calm, "we know who killed Lucien Drake. Yet there remain shadows. I believe you can help me dispel them." Her eyes remained unreadable. "How so?" Poirot leaned forward slightly. "You were once quite close to Lucien, n'est-ce pas?" Her fingers paused on the teacup's rim. "We were acquainted." "You were lovers," she blinked. "That is a strong word, but an accurate one." She set the teacup down carefully. "We had a brief understanding. It ended long before his return." Poirot tilted his head. "Did it? I wonder. The letters found among his effects tell another story." He placed a small packet on the table. 4 letters in Imogen's hand, intimate in tone, dated only months before Lucien's death. Her face paled. "Where did you find these?" she whispered. "They were concealed in a false drawer in Lucien's valise, along with a photograph of you, taken last spring." In Venice, she sat back, defeated. He said he destroyed them. He did not. Instead, he kept them. Perhaps to remind himself of your promises. Perhaps to use them later. Her voice hardened. "It was a mistake. I was lonely. My late husband, Hugo, had only recently passed. Lucien was charming, persistent, and I thought I was still capable of being loved." Poirot listened without judgment. "But he turned dark," she continued. "Controlling. He hinted he might tell Everard about us. He said I owed him more than affection. He wanted influence." Poirot's voice was quiet. "Did he ever blackmail you?" "Not in so many words. But he didn't need to. Every visit, every note, it became clearer. He was waiting for the right moment to ruin me." Poirot regarded her gently. "And yet, you didn't kill him." "No, I left him. I ended everything weeks before his return. I thought, hoped, he'd moved on." Poirot looked down at the letters. "You were not the only one he kept something over." Imogen rose slowly. "If you mean to expose me, do it. I am tired of silence." Poirot shook his head. "No, I merely wish to understand the man who smiled before he died." Julia's letter. Later that afternoon, a footman delivered a sealed envelope to Poirot. It bore no return name, only a hastily scrawled line, For your eyes only. Inside was a single-page letter, written in trembling ink. Poirot recognized the hand immediately. Julia Vale, Monsieur Poirot. I have remembered something. The night Lucien died, I received a note, slipped under my door. I thought it was from Douglas. It wasn't. It said only, "You are not your father's daughter. Ask the library." I was too afraid to go. But when I heard he had died, I knew he meant me to find something. Perhaps I should have said this earlier, but I wasn't ready. I am now. Julia Poirot reread the note 3 times. "Ask the library," he murmured. Moments later, he descended the stairs and entered the dim, silent library. Dust still clung to the window ledges. The fireplace was cold. A few books remained strewn on the floor from the night of the murder. Poirot turned his attention to the shelves. Methodically, he searched volume by volume. Then, on the 3rd shelf from the floor, he found it. A slim, false-fronted copy of Byron's collected letters. Inside was a folded envelope, yellowed and dry. Poirot opened it. It contained a birth certificate. Name, Julia Vale. Father, Hugo Halbert Poirot. Closed his eyes slowly. Ah, mon Dieu. A bloodline buried it. Was nearly dusk when Poirot sat with Sir Everard Vale in the study. The old man looked more tired than before. "You've stayed long past your time, Monsieur Poirot, and yet I must remain one night more. There is something you must see." He handed over the certificate. Everard took it, opened it, and sat very still. When he spoke, his voice was like dust. "So, it is true. You knew?" "I suspected. Years ago, Hugo came to me. He begged forgiveness, said it was a drunken mistake. He and Elizabeth, my wife, had been close in youth. One night, just once, he said." Poirot waited. "I never told Julia. I raised her as my own. I loved her more than I thought myself capable. Even when I suspected, I never wavered." Poirot nodded, and Lucien discovered this. "Yes, I do not know how, but he said he would make it known. Unless I named him heir, he was going to destroy her." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "So you wrote the new will? To protect her? To delay him? To buy time?" But he said it was not enough. Poirot said softly, "You knew what he could do, but you did not kill him." "No, but I feared someone else might." He reached into the desk and removed a second envelope. This arrived the morning after he died. "Anonymous, but I believe you should read it." Poirot opened the note. "Sir Everard, Lucien was evil. You know that now. What I did for Julia, for the girl who loved horses, who chased butterflies in the orchard, who called you Papa. You'll never know who I am. That's best. But she deserves better." He smiled when he died. He knew I would come. There was no signature. Poirot, read the letter 3 times. Then folded it gently. The final theory. That evening, Poirot walked alone through the orchard behind Thornway Hall, lost in thought. He had solved the murder by law. But the truth had bloomed beyond a single killer. Lucien Drake had built a castle of lies. He had threatened lovers, ruined reputations, and poisoned the well of legacy. And one by one, those around him had been driven to the brink. Lady Halbert had nearly sacrificed her dignity. Julia had teetered at the edge of identity. Everard had hidden the sins of others in the name of love. Felix Linton had crossed the line and paid the price. But Poirot now believed Linton's blow had not been fatal. No, someone else had come later, after the doctor left in panic. Someone who had learned the truth and finished what the first blow began. Poirot could not prove it. There was no evidence, only intuition. But the letter, the careful phrasing, the handwriting just familiar. Enough. Midnight revelation. At midnight, Poirot knocked gently on Douglas Thane's door. The young man opened it, eyes tired. "Monsieur Poirot, I must ask you one final question." Douglas nodded. "Of course." Poirot studied him. "How long have you known Julia was not Sir Everard's daughter?" Douglas stiffened. Poirot continued. "You found the birth certificate, perhaps by accident, or perhaps Lucienne showed you, intending to drive you away from her." Douglas looked away. "I didn't care. She was always Julia." Nothing changed. That. Poirot nodded slowly. "But when you saw what Lucienne planned, what he would do—" Douglas's voice cracked. He wanted to destroy her, for power, for pride. And he smiled. "Monsieur Poirot." When I entered the library, he smiled, as if he knew I was already too late. Poirot's voice was barely a whisper. "You struck him." Douglas closed his eyes. The doctor hit him first. I saw it from the hallway. But it wasn't enough. Lucienne was still alive, still smiling. He looked up at me, and he said, "You're too soft to stop me." Poirot said nothing. "I did it for her," Douglas whispered. "You can take me in. But know this, I don't regret it." Poirot looked down. "I believe," he said quietly, "that the law has its answer. And so do I. Good night, Mr. Thane." Poirot turned and walked away. Chapter 6. The smile in the mirror week had passed since the arrest of Dr. Felix Linton and the quiet departure of Hercule Poirot from Thornway Hall. Rain now fell steadily over London as Poirot sat in his modest flat on Whitehaven Mansions, sipping chamomile tea, the windows fogged with early evening chill. The fire crackled politely. Order, precision, warmth. His small sanctuary had never felt more like a retreat. And yet, his mind remained adrift. Lucienne Drake's death was now officially solved. Felix Linton, already disgraced, had confessed to the fatal blow in a fit of panic and anger. He would likely serve a sentence reduced by extenuating circumstances and character testimonials. The newspapers were satisfied. Scotland Yard was satisfied. Even Sir Everard Vale had expressed thanks with a quiet, shaking hand. But Poirot, he was not satisfied at all. A smile that lingered. There was something about Lucienne's expression in death that had haunted Poirot. People feared many things in their final moments. Pain, regret, revelation. But Lucienne Drake, for all his cunning and cruelty, had smiled. Not a smirk of victory, nor the grin of a man who thought he might survive, but a knowing smile. A smile as if the last move had been his. Poirot had seen many faces of the dead, anguish, surprise, peace, but rarely satisfaction. That alone had kept the little Belgian's thoughts spiraling long after returning to London. The envelope revisited on his desk sat the anonymous letter given to Sir Everard Vale, the one that read, "Smiled when he died. He knew I would come." Poirot now examined it with renewed scrutiny. The letter was untraceable, typed on a standard machine, printed on common paper stock, no postmark, no signature. But Poirot had not forgotten Douglas Thane's confession, nor the tremble in his voice as he recounted how Lucienne had welcomed death. Why then did Poirot doubt it? Because there had been one more glass of port on the table that night. 3 glasses, not 2. Poirot remembered distinctly Lucien's, Sir Everard's, and one untouched left at the far end of the table, as if meant for a third guest who never arrived, or one who did, and left no trace. A visit from Inspector Japp, just as Poirot began pacing. A knock came at the door. He opened it to find Inspector Japp, soaked from the rain and holding a folded newspaper. "Evening, Poirot. Thought you might. Want to see this?" Poirot raised a brow. "What a pleasant surprise. Do come in." Japp threw off his coat and handed over the paper. Bottom of page 7. Poirot unfolded it carefully and found the headline: Douglas Thane appointed head of Vale Foundation. Sir Everard Vale announced today that Douglas Thane, longtime family friend and business protégé, will lead the newly restructured Vale Foundation. Poirot read in silence. "Bit convenient, don't you think?" Japp said, pouring himself some of Poirot's tea without asking. Poirot didn't answer. Japp sat, watching him. "I know you think Linton didn't finish the job, but the Crown's happy with his confession. No physical evidence against anyone else. And Thane, he's clean. Not a single mark on his file." Poirot tapped his chin. "Yes, clean. But clean can be misleading." Japp chuckled. "You're not done, are you?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, mon ami, Hercule Poirot is never done until the last thread is tied." A final walk through shadows. 2 days later, Poirot returned to Thornway, Hall unannounced. The leaves had fallen completely now. The trees were bare, the wind had a sharper bite, and the hall seemed even more ancient under grey skies. Sir Everard welcomed him at the door with a stiff embrace. "Monsieur Poirot, you are always welcome here, but I thought you'd completed your work." "I have, Sir Everard," Poirot replied, "and yet I must ask your permission to examine Lucien's effects one final time." Everard nodded slowly. "Of course, they're still in his room. I couldn't bring myself to touch anything." Poirot bowed and made his way to Lucien Drake's chamber. Inside, the room had been left almost exactly as it was. A faint musk of cologne still lingered. Poirot examined the wardrobe, drawers, and desk with meticulous care. But it was the fireplace that drew his attention. The ashes were long cold, but Poirot saw a small charred remnant at the edge of the grate. With tweezers, he retrieved it. A sheer sliver of blackened card, with the faintest trace of embossed lettering. He brought it to the window. The letters barely visible were Grasse, and the edge of a crimson wax seal. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Grasse, the Crimson Club. That evening, Poirot made a quiet visit to the Crimson Club, a private establishment known to serve the elite of Britain's old families. He requested a membership ledger. The concierge resisted until Poirot dropped the names of a few influential patrons and hinted at an investigation. He found what he needed: Lucien Drake, Douglas Thane, Hugo Halberd, all members. And intriguingly, so was Dr. Felix Linton. The club was more than just luxury. It was a network. A private gathering place where favors were exchanged and secrets carefully bartered. Poirot's mind began racing. What if Lucien had been planning more than just an inheritance play? What if he had intended to drag the entire Halberd Vale family into ruin through connections made here? Contacts, transactions, threads. The motive widened. Lucien had not simply blackmailed for a money or favor. He had been constructing a coup, a systemic dismantling of reputation, legacy, and power. And perhaps someone close had realized this too late. Julia's realization. Back at Thornway Hall, Poirot found Julia Vale walking the gardens alone, bundled in a coat. Her face pale but composed. "I thought you'd gone," she said softly. "I returned for the truth," Poirot replied, "and perhaps for peace." They walked for a time in silence before Poirot said, "Do you know what Lucien feared most?" Julia looked puzzled. He never seemed afraid of anything. Poirot smiled faintly. "Exactly. But the one thing he could not control was love. The genuine kind. You and Douglas. That bond was beyond his reach. And he hated it." Julia nodded, her eyes misting. "He tried to poison everything." Poirot looked at her intently. "Did you ever suspect Douglas?" She hesitated. "No, but after you left, he changed, quieter. He doesn't look me in the eyes anymore." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Sometimes guilt does not scream. It whispers." Resolution in silence. Poirot never filed a report. He never called Jap again. He never told Sir Everard the full extent of what he'd found. Instead, 1 week later, he mailed a plain envelope to Douglas Thane, containing only 2 items: a photograph of the charred club card fragment, and a note that read, "You stood between darkness and a girl who knew only light. The world is quiet now. Let it stay that way." Poirot never heard back. Epilogue. The Man Who Smiled Before He Died. Months later, in a quiet restaurant near Hyde Park, Poirot sat with Hastings, who had returned from Argentina on business. "So the case is over?" Hastings asked. "Yes," Poirot said, slicing into his trout. "The murderer confessed. The others live in peace." "And yet," Hastings said, "you still look troubled." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Hastings, imagine a man who dies not with fear but satisfaction, because even in death, he believes he has outmaneuvered everyone." Hastings blinked. "You mean Lucia?" Poirot nodded. "Yes." He smiled because he thought he had corrupted everything, that his poison would linger. He paused. "But the greatest justice, mon ami, is that those he meant to destroy have chosen to live, not in fear, not in bitterness, but in truth. That is why I never said his name again in Thornway Hall. Let the dead have their silence." Hastings nodded slowly. "And the living?" Poirot smiled gently. "They will never forget, but they will endure." Chapter 7. Echoes and Embers. The winter in London thickened like a slow fog over the city's veins, muffling the rhythm of the streets and dulling the edges of memory. The case at Thornway Hall was finished, publicly at least, but Poirot, the habit of quiet observation, watched how the echoes of the crime lingered like the scent of burnt paper, long after the flame. Though he had said nothing to the authorities, nor formally named Douglas Thane as the orchestrator behind Lucien Drake's demise, the matter was far from gone in the corridors of Poirot's mind. He believed in justice, but also in balance, and sometimes balance demanded silence. Or a visit from Julia Vale. One rainy afternoon, Poirot was surprised by a soft knock at the door of Whitehaven Mansions. "Julia Vale," she introduced, cheeks rosy from the cold, eyes filled with cautious warmth. Poirot stood aside. "Mademoiselle, what a pleasure. You are always welcome." She stepped in, removing her gloves. "I'm on my way to the continent. I sail tomorrow. Thought I'd see you before I left." Poirot poured her tea and gestured toward the fire. "Is this for business or for healing?" Julia smiled faintly. "A bit of both. I need time away, time to think, time to forget." Poirot sat across from her, fingers steepled. Forgetting is the trick of the soul. Remembering, however, is the art of the heart. She nodded. Douglas and I, we ended things, or maybe we just left them unfinished. I still don't know what to believe. Poirot didn't reply at first. Then he said, "There are truths we carry because they help us walk, and truths we leave behind because they would make us fall." She looked at him. Which was Douglas? He smiled sadly. Both. A letter from the past. After she left, Poirot returned to his desk. Among his mail was a package. Unmarked. No return address. Inside he found a worn leather journal, wrapped in linen, with a note in elegant curved handwriting. "For your discretion, Monsieur Poirot, and your silence. You were never wrong, but you were kind. D.T." The journal, embossed with faint initials, was unmistakably Douglas Thane's. Poirot hesitated before opening it, but the curiosity, a hunger as old as his days in Belgium, overcame him. The Journal of Douglas Thane. The entries began nearly a year prior to Lucien's death. January 12th. I fear what Lucien is capable of. He knows things that could ruin Sir Everard, destroy Julia, destroy me. But worse, he enjoys knowing it. He plays with knowledge, like a child plays with a match in a dry field. February 3rd. Lucien showed me a document today. A trust agreement. He has altered the Vale Foundation charter. If he dies, the remaining assets fall to the Foundation's operational head. A title he offered me today, while laughing. I declined. Of course I declined. March 21st. He told me over port, with that same sneer, that Sir Everard once altered military records to protect a comrade. He has letters, proof. If those letters were released, it would be the end of him. I begin to suspect Lucien knows he is hated, that he craves it. His death, when it comes, because I do not believe he expects. To live long will be deliberate. He will design it like a sculptor finishing his masterpiece. Poirot read with furrowed brow. June 7th. I believe he wants to die. Not by his own hand, no. He wants to be destroyed. Murdered. He is shaping the conditions for it. Testing us, provoking. Offering the perfect moral rationale to eliminate him. And yet, he smiles through it all. July 14th. If he pushes Julia again, I will not restrain myself. This is not bluster. This is not impulse. This is inevitability. And finally, in a trembling script, August 29th. Saw the smile. The moment the blow landed, he was already gone. Not from the strike, but from the moment before, as if he had already stepped out of time, leaving a grin like a coat dropped at the door. Poirot closed the journal, the whisper of a confession. It was not proof, not by any legal standard, but it was truth. Poirot placed the journal in a locked drawer. He had no intention of using it. Sometimes the resolution of a case did not depend on prosecution, but on understanding the nature of evil and the capacity of human grief. Hastings returns to the case. In early January, Captain Hastings rejoined Poirot for a few days, bringing sharp winter air and his usual questions. "You've gone quiet since Thornway," Hastings said one morning over breakfast. "No new cases? Not even a stolen jewel to occupy your little grey cells?" Poirot shook his head. "No, mon ami. There are times when even the grey cells must rest, or reflect." Hastings lowered his toast. "But Lucien's case, it is resolved, yes?" Poirot sighed, leaning back. Resolved in facts, not in feeling. I never liked the sound of that fellow, Hastings muttered, the type who toys with people, pulls strings and laughs when the marionettes fall. Indeed, Poirot said, eyes distant. But tell me, Hastings, when a man engineers his own destruction and others oblige him, who then is the villain? Hastings blinked. The man who dies, or the one who lets him? Poirot didn't answer. A letter to Sir Everard of the Abbaye de Jeux. Eve of the new year, Poirot penned a letter to Sir Everard Vale. My dear Sir Everard, in this season of reflection, I write not as an investigator, but as a friend. You have suffered much, and yet I urge you to hold fast to one truth. Not every fire that burns leaves behind ash. Some leave seeds. You must rebuild not only the foundation, but the future for those who bear your name. Julia is strong, but she needs more than legacy. She needs hope. May the coming year offer peace and clarity. Yours, Hercule Poirot. He sealed the letter and sent it the next morning. The final clue, on January 10th, Poirot received a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, a small item fell into his hand. A silver cufflink, engraved with the initials LD and the symbol of a snake devouring its tail, an Ouroboros. Poirot froze. He had seen Lucien wear these only once. The symbol, a cycle of death and rebirth, had always seemed too theatrical for him. But there was something more. Wrapped around the cufflink was a note. You once said the smile meant he had won. But perhaps he had simply accepted that he could not defeat us. The serpent ends where it began. The circle is broken. He will not smile again. No signature, no address, no trace, only an echo. Poirot's reflection. That night, Poirot stood before his mirror. He examined his reflection, the impeccable mustache, the watchful eyes, the lines of time. Lucien Drake had died smiling. Douglas Thane had lived walking over razor's edge, and Julia Vale had chosen solitude over scandal. What had Poirot done? He had chosen silence, not because he feared truth, but because the truth sometimes cannot heal. It can only wound further. Poirot touched the cufflink once more and placed it in his desk drawer, beside the journal, beside the letter. There are crimes of action, he thought. And then there are crimes of silence. But sometimes silence is the only justice that remains. Chapter 8. The Weight of Silence. The snow that January fell not in flurries, but in long, deliberate descents. London, blanketed under silence, seemed to exhale, its breath crystallizing in alleys and atop lampposts like quiet judgment. Hercule Poirot, though a man who usually preferred order to introspection, had not taken a new case since Thornway Hall. His files remained closed, his shoes polished daily, rested untouched at the doorway. He was a man in waiting, though for what, even he did not yet know. It was on a dull gray morning, with the sound of the city still muffled beneath the weight of snow, that Poirot received a telegram, short, clean, calculated, from Scotland Yard, re-case file, Noir Doctor 301, Lucien Drake, new evidence, submitted anonymously, request, private audience. Inspector Poirot rose, his spine straight as ever, and murmured only one word, enfin, the return to Scotland Yard. Inspector Japp was older now, not slower, but more burdened. The years had made him wary of brilliance, even when it wore a perfectly knotted tie and twirled a mustache. He greeted Poirot with a nod. Glad you came. Didn't think I'd need to call you back into this one. But things have shifted. Poirot folded his gloves with surgical precision. The world, mon ami, shifts always. It is men who pretend otherwise. Japp waved toward his desk. 2 days ago, a parcel came in. No return. Inside, we found a copy of a recording, vinyl, accompanied by a single typed note. This is what he wanted remembered. Poirot's brows furrowed. A recording? He asked. Japp nodded. Voice only. We had it transferred. Take a listen. He clicked play. A soft hiss gave way to Lucian Drake's unmistakable voice. If you're hearing this, then I've succeeded. No, not in dying. That's incidental. I've succeeded in pushing them to reveal what they truly are. Veils dropped. Masks shattered. That is the victory. Douglas always needed someone to rescue. Julia always needed someone to disappoint her. And Sir Everard, well, he needed a sin buried deeper than the others could find. Do not pity me. I arranged my fall with care. What they did, what any of them did, was only the final movement of a concerto I composed long ago. Poirot listened in silence as the voice continued its cadence like theater, its tone unnervingly calm. You see, truth has no virtue if left unsaid, and so I record mine. Even now I imagine Poirot sitting in some armchair, piecing my smile apart like a puzzle with missing corners. But here's what he won't say. Sometimes the man who smiles is not the villain. Sometimes he is merely the one who understands the game best. Goodbye, or perhaps, finally, hello. The recording ended with a soft click. Interpretation. Japp crossed his arms. It's not a confession, not exactly, but it confirms he knew what was coming. Poirot nodded slowly. A man who designs his own downfall and ensures it is remembered. There is a kind of brilliance in it, twisted we, but brilliance nonetheless. Do we reopen the case? Poirot shook his head. What would you charge? Suicide by manipulation? Manslaughter by moral provocation? The law, Japp, is not a net wide enough to catch such ghosts. Japp sighed. So that's it, then? No, Poirot said, rising. That is merely the echo. There is still the wound, a visit to Julia. The halls of the Vale Foundation had been repainted. New banners hung in the atrium. Julia Vale, though pale, carried herself with dignity. When Poirot entered her office, she did not rise, but her eyes softened. You heard the tape, she said. Yes, he replied. It was inevitable someone would hear it. He made sure of that. Julia opened a drawer and handed him a folded letter. Poirot read silently. Hercule Poirot will understand. He always does. But don't ask him for peace, Julia. Ask him for memory. That's what he protects. L.D. He sent it to me a week before the incident, she said. I never opened it until today. Poirot looked at her. Do you feel anger? I did. Now I feel hollow. He robbed you of the illusion, Poirot said gently. Of control, of moral clarity. He made each of you doubt yourselves. Julia's voice wavered. I don't know what that makes him. Poirot's gaze sharpened. It makes him a man. Flawed. Brilliant. Cruel. And now, gone. A shadow at the gravesite. The snow was thick atop Lucian Drake's grave when Poirot arrived 2 days later. Few had visited since the burial. Even fewer had said his name. Poirot stood alone until footsteps approached from behind. It was Douglas Thane. They stood without speaking for a moment. Then Poirot said, You sent the cufflink. Thane didn't deny it. You feared that if no one remembered him, Poirot continued, he would have won. Thane's voice was low. He always wins, doesn't he? Poirot turned. Only if we let his memory remain only venom. Even serpents can shed their skins. Thane met his eyes. I left the Foundation. I gave up the position Lucien had maneuvered me toward. Julia has taken over. Poirot nodded. Good. She will lead with clarity. Thane stared at the grave. I still see his smile, even now. Poirot stepped forward and placed a single white rose on the snow. Then remember that smile, not as victory, but as surrender. They parted in silence. Poirot's final record, weeks later, in the quiet of Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot opened a blank page in his personal ledger. He recorded case, Lucien Drake, deceased manner of death, homicide by consequence, suicide by design, guilty parties, none by law, several by conscience, justice incomplete, but present. Verdict: a man who smiled not because he triumphed, but because he lost control and made the loss appear deliberate. He closed the book. There were no arrests, no trials, only memory, only silence. And in that silence, Hercule Poirot sat in his armchair, gazing at the firelight dancing across the cufflink in his palm, its serpent etched eternally into itself. He whispered to the quiet, "Some puzzles, mon ami, are not meant to be solved, only understood." Chapter 9. The Eye of the Labyrinth. Whitehaven Mansions was unusually still. Poirot had not spoken to Hastings for 3 days, though his friend had dropped by twice. The detective's solitude was not melancholic. It was analytical. In his mind, the labyrinth of Lucien Drake's final days had yet to reveal its center. One could map a crime. But this was not a crime. It was a performance, a riddle with no question mark, only ellipses. That morning, as the sleet painted cold tears upon his windows, Poirot sat at his desk and reviewed the dossier again. Every note, every letter, every transcription of interviews, the tape, the cufflink, Julia's folded letter, and one oddity he had not mentioned to Jap, a second envelope. It had been slipped under his door the night of the burial, unmarked. Inside was a single typed message. If a man can orchestrate his own downfall, he can also leave behind a false bottom. Poirot did not know what disturbed him more, the cryptic message or the implication that Lucien's smile had been incomplete, Sir Everard's secret. The first clue came from an unlikely place, a cancelled estate sale. Poirot had learned through a connection at Sotheby's that Sir Everard Marsh had quietly retracted plans to liquidate several paintings. Works he had sworn under oath were his only remaining assets. Intrigued, Poirot requested a private meeting. Sir Everard did not welcome him warmly. "I had hoped this matter was concluded," he said, swirling brandy in a glass like it were courage. "Hope is for poets," Poirot replied gently. "Here for the truth," Sir Everard smirked. "What more truth do you seek?" "The man is dead." "Exactly," Poirot said, "which makes his ghost all the louder." Everard said nothing. Poirot leaned in. "Where did the paintings go, Sir Everard? Not sold, clearly. And yet you claimed financial ruin. Lucien bailed you out. Why?" The older man flinched. "Just slightly," Poirot noticed. "I don't know what you're implying." "I am not implying. I am stating you owed Lucien Drake more than money. You owed him silence." Everard stood abruptly, bracing himself against the mantel. "I don't need to answer that." "You don't," Poirot agreed, "but someone else will." He turned to leave. Sir Everard spoke before Poirot reached the door. "There were letters," he said. Poirot paused. "From years ago. Lucien somehow obtained them. Letters from me to a young student. Nothing. Illegal, but certainly compromising." Poirot nodded slowly. "So, Lucien did not merely assist you. He owned you." Sir Everard didn't reply. Julia's dilemma. Poirot next visited Julia Vale. She had grown paler, but more composed. She poured them both tea in her office, though her hands shook slightly. "Did Lucien blackmail Everard?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," Julia sighed, staring at the steam from her cup. "Then he controlled everything, even now." Poirot tilted his head. "No, mademoiselle. Control is an illusion. Even Lucien, in his calculations, missed something vital." "What?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "You," she blinked. "Me? You who have changed since his death. You who have not sought to defend or vilify him. You are the pivot." Julia looked down. "He left a final package, for me. Said it was to be opened only when I made peace with his death." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" "No," she whispered. He did not press. Instead, he placed a hand on the parcel, resting on her desk like a buried mine. "When you are ready, mademoiselle. Not before." A visit from Hastings that evening. Poirot sat in his apartment with Captain Hastings, finally breaking his silence. "I must confess, old chap," Hastings said, sipping from a steaming cup. "This whole affair unsettles me." "Naturellement," Poirot replied. "It was designed to do so. But why? What could he gain by orchestrating such misery?" Poirot stood and walked to the window. Lucien Drake was not seeking gain. He was seeking remembrance. He wished to burn bridges so brightly that no one could look away. "But what does that mean, Poirot? He's dead. He can't see how anyone reacts." Poirot turned. "Ah, but mon ami, that is where you misunderstand. Lucien believed in legacy more than life, in the echo more than the sound." Hastings frowned. "Then we're playing into his hands. Unless," Poirot said softly, "we choose a different melody." The final interview. Douglas Thane. Douglas Thane had retreated to a modest flat in Paddington. His appearance was his voice, calmer. Poirot visited him at dusk. "You seem lighter," Poirot observed. "I'm not," Thane said, "just resigned." "To what?" "To the fact that nothing Lucien said or did was without layers." Poirot nodded. "And yet, the truth does not always lie beneath. Sometimes it is the one floating just above." Douglas gave a bitter laugh. "You think there's a simple answer?" "No," Poirot said, "but there is a simple intent." Handed Thane a copy of the anonymous message. If a man can orchestrate his own downfall, he can also leave behind a false bottom. Douglas read it and paled. Poirot caught the reaction. "You've seen that phrase before?" Douglas hesitated, then nodded, in his notebooks, a week before he died. "I didn't understand it then." Poirot leaned closer. What if Lucien did not intend to die that night? Douglas looked up sharply. Poirot continued. What if he was orchestrating guilt, but not death? What if someone accelerated the plan? Douglas's face changed. "You think someone murdered him?" Poirot stood. "No, I think someone made a choice he did not expect." The puzzle. Within the puzzle back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot retrieved the notes. He lined them out on his table. Lucien Drake had staged everything. The betrayal, the exposure, the clues. But what if someone else had seized control in the final act? The second cup of wine. The moment the lights had flickered. The fact that Lucien's expression, just before collapsing, had been one not of triumph, but of surprise. Poirot whispered to himself, "You smiled, yes, but not because you planned to die. You smiled because you had forced them all to face themselves. But then you died." He picked up the original post-mortem report again. One anomaly. Traces of a second sedative, not consistent with Lucien's prescribed medication. It had been dismissed as residue from previous usage. Poirot now suspected otherwise. Someone had helped him into death, not Lucien's will. Another's hand-ought conclusion of Chapter 9. Poirot now knew the truth hovered just beyond reach. The serpent on the cufflink had not only symbolized Lucien, it symbolized the circle of guilt, consuming itself again and again. But within that circle, someone had snapped the chain. Lucien Drake had planned a theatrical fall from grace, hoping to survive in memory. But instead, someone ensured he never rose again. And Hercule Poirot, the man who honored order above all else, now stood on the threshold of disorder's most terrible question. Who killed the man who planned to die? Chapter 10. The Grand Unraveling. The air in the drawing room was heavy, filled with anticipation. The muted light from the chandelier above cast long, sharp shadows across the marble floors. The dozen or so people gathered. Sir Everard Marsh, Julia Vale, Douglas Thane, and the others stood rigid, their expressions a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Poirot had asked them all to gather. It was time for the curtain to fall, for the final move to be made in this intricate game of psychological chess. Hastings, standing by the door, shot Poirot a look of quiet understanding. The detective stood at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the group. He didn't need to speak immediately. The silence was as loud as a thunderclap. They all knew this moment was coming. The culmination of days of careful maneuvering, the slow peeling away of layers, the gradual shifting of motives. Poirot, always calm, his hands tucked neatly into the pockets of his jacket, broke the silence. "Sure, I miss," he began, his French accent giving his words an added layer of gravitas. "We are gathered here today not to speak of what we see, but of what we do not see." The group shifted nervously. Sir Everard gave a cough. Julia's hand trembled slightly as she clasped it in her lap. Only Thane stood stoically, his eyes locked onto Poirot, awaiting the inevitable. "The case, you see," Poirot continued, "is not as it appears. The pieces on the board have been arranged, but not by the hand of Lucien Drake, the man who smiled before he died." A low murmur rippled through the group. Sir Everard's eyes darted away, but Julia's gaze was unwavering, as if Poirot had opened a door into her mind that she didn't wish to enter. "I will not keep you in suspense," Poirot said. And then he smiled, his lips curling up just slightly, an expression that never failed to send a chill through anyone in the room. The true culprit, the hand that played the final card, was not Lucien. It was never Lucien. It was, in fact, you, Sir Everard Marsh. The gasps were audible. Sir Everard's face turned ashen, but he did not speak. He merely stood there, frozen, like a man caught in the jaws of a trap. Poirot continued, pacing slowly, his steps measured as though he were an artist arranging a final piece. "You see, Sir Everard," Poirot said, his voice even and precise. Lucian Drake was a man of complex motives. He understood psychology better than most. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer who played with the strings of his friends, his enemies, and yes, even his benefactors. But his death, his supposed fall from grace, was no accident. He orchestrated it, but not as you all believed. No, he did not wish to die. He simply sought to make you believe that he would. Sir Everard shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She could not believe what she was hearing. Poirot halted and turned to face Sir Everard fully. You, Sir Everard, were his greatest pawn, though you did not know it, Poirot said slowly, savoring each word. The paintings, the debts, the letters, all were a smokescreen. Lucian had planned a fall from grace for you, but it would not have been enough to bankrupt you or ruin you outright. No, it was the public spectacle he craved, the exposure of your deepest secrets. Everard's lips parted, but no words came out. Poirot's eyes glittered with the thrill of the chase. Lucian understood that to truly destroy you, he must first make you believe in your own control. He fed you lies, convinced you that you were free, when in truth you were a marionette in his show. The letters to the young student, merely one piece. The paintings, another. Everything led back to your ego, Sir Everard. You wanted to be seen as the victim, and Lucian gave you that role. Sir Everard's breathing became shallow. You're wrong, he whispered. I am not, Poirot responded. The clue was in the final days before his death. The smile you all speak of. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was irony. Lucian had made you play your part, but then he knew you would turn on him. The room was silent again, except for the faint sound of Sir Everard's labored breathing. Poirot paused for a moment, letting the words settle. The final reveal, Poirot's voice was calm and methodical now. You see, Sir Everard, Lucian Drake did not die because of a simple revenge. He died because of greed. Greed that was not his, own but yours. Hastings, watching from the corner, understood what was coming. He had watched Poirot gather the pieces over the last few days, assembling a picture of psychological motives that only the great detective could see. Poirot's gaze moved to the others in the room. Julia Vale, he said, turning to her, you knew Lucian better than anyone else. But what you did not know was that your involvement in his life was part of his final scheme, one that was designed to make you feel both guilt and release. He gave you the power to absolve him, but the truth is that you did not absolve him. No, you became a part of the game, unwittingly playing your own part in Lucian's grandest trick. Julia looked at him with wide eyes, the realization dawning upon her. She had been a pawn, just as Sir Everard had been. And Douglas Thane, Poirot said, turning to the last of the main players. You too played a part. Your connection to Lucian was deeper than any of you realized. It was not out of friendship, but necessity. Lucian needed you to believe in his control. He needed you to believe that the truth could only come from him. But you, Douglas, were the most important witness of all. You saw the final piece before anyone else, that Lucian Drake had forsworn the very thing he had orchestrated. He had arranged everything to make you believe he was in charge. But all the while, he was setting the stage for your personal failure, not his. Douglas Thane opened his mouth, but was unable to speak. Poirot's voice dropped to a soft whisper as he delivered the final blow. But the most important detail, the detail that none of you noticed, is that Lucian Drake smiled before he died, not because he knew his death was imminent, but because he knew his plan would succeed. The irony, you see, is that he left no one in control. The culprit, Poirot, paused. Everyone was tense. Their eyes were locked on him, waiting for the final answer. Poirot took one last step towards Sir Everard. The true murderer, the one who killed Lucian Drake, in that final moment, was not a simple case of passion or betrayal. Poirot said, his voice steady. It was a calculated decision made by none other than you, Sir Everard Marsh. The room fell silent, save for the sound of Everard's breathing. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. Lucian was going to expose you, to ruin everything you held dear, Poirot continued. You had no choice in your mind but to act. You poisoned his drink that night, just as Lucian had poisoned you with his lies for years. Sir Everard collapsed into the chair behind him, his face pale, his mind racing. Poirot stood for a moment in the silence, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. Then he turned to the others. I must leave now, Poirot said, his tone final. But remember this, Lucian Drake was a master of deception, and so are we all in the end. His final game was not about death, it was about legacy. With that, he exited the room, leaving behind a group of stunned individuals, each of them now forced to face the truth that they too were victims of the man who smiled before he died. Chapter 11. The Aftermath and the Quiet Reflection. The case of Lucian Drake had come to a close. The fine threads of deception had been untangled, and justice, however bittersweet, had been served. The day after Poirot's revelation, Sir Everard Marsh was taken into custody. Julia Vale, the daughter of the late philanthropist, was left to pick up the pieces of her fractured life, while Douglas Thane, his role in the tragedy now exposed, quietly retreated into his own thoughts, forever marked by the events he could never undo. Hercule Poirot had, as always, done his job with a precision that could only come from a mind honed by years of observing human nature. And yet, as he sat alone in his modest London apartment, looking out over the bustling city, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true victory was not in solving the crime, but in the quiet, inward satisfaction of having caught the subtle intricacies of the human heart. The reflection. The sunlight poured through the window, casting a golden hue over the carefully arranged items on Poirot's desk. His little gray cells were quiet now, but that did not mean the questions stopped. His thoughts circled, as they always did, back to the same central truth. Why had Sir Everard Marsh committed murder? Why had Lucian Drake manipulated those around him with such profound precision? The answers, while logical and clear too, Poirot's mind were not easily digestible. In the world of deduction, the rules were simple, but in the world of emotions and motivations, the truth was far more elusive. Poirot reached for a cup of tea, his hands moving with deliberate care. His mind drifted to the before the murder, to the subtle clues he had picked up in conversations, the smallest inconsistencies in alibis and emotions that others might have missed. He had been patient, allowing the pieces of the puzzle to come together, and yet, despite his success, there was a lingering question that had followed him throughout the investigation. Had justice truly been served? Poirot's gaze moved to the small framed photograph on his desk, the one of his beloved homeland, Belgium. In that moment, he found himself thinking not of the solution to the case, but of the people left behind. The guilty had been caught, But what of those who were innocent? Julia Vale, the woman who had been so intricately woven into the web of lies spun by Lucien and Sir Everard, had never wanted any of this. She was a victim of manipulation, her life turned upside down by a man she thought she could trust. And yet, how could Poirot feel pity for her when she too had been complicit, however unwittingly, in the very game that led to her father's death? The aftermath for the others in the days following Sir Everard's arrest, Julia Vale had reached out to Poirot, seeking some kind of solace, some understanding of the events that had destroyed everything she had ever known. Her message had been polite but desperate, an invitation to meet. Poirot, ever the observer, had declined the meeting. He did not believe that a meeting with her would bring him anything but more questions. The human heart, after all, was a labyrinth of contradictions, and Julia Vale's heart was no exception. But there was also the matter of Douglas Thane. He had been the one who, despite his aloof demeanor, seemed to know more than he let on. Poirot's subtle questioning had revealed that Thane had been more than just a witness to the events. He had been a confidant, a key player in the unspoken tension between Lucien and Sir Everard. It was Thane's position as an outsider, as a man who had been at the periphery of the game, but never quite inside, that had made him a dangerous figure. Yet, his role had been secondary. He was a spectator, as much a victim of Lucien's schemes as anyone else. Poirot had considered visiting him, but again he chose not to. Some wounds, Poirot knew, were better left untouched. Poirot's thoughts on human nature, as Poirot sipped his tea, his thoughts once more returned to the broader themes of the case. What was it that drove people to commit such acts of deception, betrayal, and murder? Lucien Drake had been a man of intelligence, a man who had understood human nature, perhaps better than anyone in the room. His murder was not about greed or jealousy alone. It was about control, the need to be seen as the ultimate master of every situation. For all of his manipulation, however, he had underestimated one thing: the human desire for freedom. Even Sir Everard, whose ego had driven him to destroy the very life that Lucien had crafted for him, had found his breaking point. People were not as malleable as Lucien had believed. Sir Everard had been driven by his pride, his need for control over a life he felt slipping away. Lucien had played on those vulnerabilities, and in doing so had exposed the very thing that led to his own demise. Julia Vale had been a tragic figure, caught between the love for her father and the emotional manipulation of a man who had sought to twist her sense of loyalty into something far darker. And yet, despite everything, she had ultimately made the choice to step away from the toxic web she had been woven into. It was a small victory, one that Poirot acknowledged quietly. The final words, Poirot set his cup down and rose from his desk, walking slowly to the window. The city of London sprawled beneath him, bustling with life, oblivious to the quiet detective who had solved yet another case. Human beings, Poirot mused, were creatures of complexity. They hid their true selves behind facades, creating layers upon layers of misdirection and confusion. It was the task of a detective, someone like himself, to strip away those layers and reveal the core of truth that lay beneath. The case of Lucien Drake had been but another example of the lengths to which people would go to preserve their secrets. It had been a test of Poirot's abilities, yes, but it was also a reminder of the frailty of the human condition. No matter how many puzzles he solved, no matter how many criminals he caught, Poirot was always left with the same sense of quiet melancholy. For in the end, it was not the crimes he solved that mattered, but the human hearts that had caught them. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the clouds, Poirot returned to his desk and began writing in his journal. His hand moved with the practiced precision of a man who had seen too much and yet never enough. The case was over. Justice had been served. But as Poirot closed the journal and turned out the light, he knew one thing for certain. The human mind was an enigma, one that even his little gray cells could not fully decipher. For that, Poirot would always remain in search of the next mystery. Chapter 12. The Final Reflection. The investigation had ended, but Hercule Poirot's mind was far from quiet. As the weeks passed after the conclusion of Lucien Drake's murder and the subsequent arrest of Sir Everard Marsh, Poirot found himself still ruminating on the case, turning it over and over in his mind like a stone he could not put down. A quiet reconciliation, Poirot had always been an observer of human nature, and the murder of Lucien Drake had revealed much to him, not just about the crime, but about the way in which people tried to cover their tracks, the manner in which they wove their deceptions and falsehoods in order to protect themselves. The case had been a masterpiece of misdirection, with every suspect hiding something, each one seemingly motivated by their own desires, but all equally trapped in the web of their lies. In the days following Sir Everard's arrest, Poirot had received a letter from Julia Vale. It was a brief note, the ink smudged slightly, but the words were sincere. She thanked Poirot for his help in bringing the truth to light, acknowledging the pain it had caused, but also the closure it had brought to her. She spoke of the difficult road ahead, but expressed hope that she could rebuild her life after the tragedy. Poirot had read the letter several times, his fingers tracing the words, and had wondered, not for the first time, about the true cost of justice. There was no satisfaction in seeing a man like Sir Everard brought to justice, no joy in exposing the lies that had been carefully constructed for years. In fact, there was only a profound weariness. Poirot's final visit to the scene, it was, on an afternoon tinged with melancholy, that Poirot found himself once more walking through the grand halls of Ashcombe House. The setting of the tragic events, the house, once vibrant with laughter and celebration, now stood silent, its echoing rooms holding nothing but the memories of a crime that had shaken them to their core. The once stylish mansion, a symbol of power and wealth, now felt like a hollow shell. The guests who had attended Sir Everard's fateful party had long since departed, leaving behind only whispers of the affair that had turned a social gathering into a scene of murder and betrayal. Poirot stood in the drawing-room where Lucien Drake had been found dead, his face frozen in a smile that was anything but reassuring. The room was immaculate now, but the air was heavy with the ghosts of the past. Poirot, ever the careful observer, could not help but examine every corner, every detail, searching for something he had missed, even though he knew it was impossible. The case had been solved. The guilty had been caught. Yet, standing there alone, Poirot felt a strange sense of unease settle over him, the puzzle of human nature. As he left the mansion, Poirot's thoughts turned inward once more. The conclusion of a case always left him with a sense of emptiness, as though the puzzle he had so carefully pieced together had no true resolution. The crime had been solved, but the reasons behind it, human nature itself, remained as elusive as ever. What had driven Sir Everard to kill? What had Lucien Drake truly hoped to gain from his calculated game of manipulation? And what about the others? Had they been victims too, swept up in the chaos of their own emotions and desires? Poirot knew that the human heart was an enigma. The deeper one delved into the motives and behaviors of people, the more convoluted the puzzle became. There were no easy answers, no neatly tied-up conclusions, only shades of gray, where truth and deception coexisted in a delicate balance. Hastings's final thoughts, as was often the case, Poirot's trusted friend, Captain Hastings, had been at his side during much of the investigation. Though Hastings had been more a passive participant than a co-investigator, his presence was always a source of comfort for Poirot. After the case was closed, Hastings had taken it upon himself to write a final account of the investigation, a piece that would capture the drama, the tension, and the eventual resolution. It was, of course, Poirot who would be the hero of the story. But Hastings had a way of conveying the human side of their adventures. The friendship, the quiet moments of reflection, the interplay between Poirot's brilliance and Hastings' steadfast loyalty. Poirot had read the manuscript with his usual care, his sharp eyes scanning every word. When he finished, he closed the file and placed it on his desk. "Mon ami," Poirot had said, "you have captured the essence of our investigation, but there is one thing you must know. The real mystery, the one that will always remain unsolved, is not in the crimes we uncover. It lies in the hearts of those who commit them." A final reflection on Justice Poirot sat at his desk that evening, writing the last of his thoughts in his journal. He realized something that had always been at the core of his work. Justice was never about the outcome. It was about understanding. Understanding the motives, understanding the person behind the crime, and understanding the deeper truths of human nature. He had solved the case of Lucian Drake, yes, but what he had truly uncovered was far more profound. The complex interplay of emotions, desires, fears, and contradictions that defined human beings was the true puzzle. It was a puzzle that could never be fully solved, not by him, not by anyone, for each person held their own mysteries, their own secrets, locked away behind their eyes. Poirot closed his journal, satisfied for the moment. There would be more cases, more mysteries to unravel, but for now he allowed himself a brief respite from the intricacies of human behavior, knowing that, in his own way, he had touched the heart of the matter. Chapter 13. A New Case Awaits. The days following the resolution of the Lucian Drake case were filled with a kind of calm that Poirot was not accustomed to. The tension had dissipated, the puzzle solved, but the restlessness in Poirot's mind never quite ceased. As much as he longed for peace, he knew that a detective of his caliber could never remain idle for long. An unexpected visitor. It was a bright and brisk morning when the letter arrived, slipping through the cracks of Poirot's carefully curated world like a shadow passing through a door left slightly ajar. The envelope was thick and elegant, the handwriting sharp and confident, a stark contrast to the ordinary post that usually arrived at his door. Hastings, who had long since returned to his own pursuits, had gone out for the day. Poirot was alone, in his study when the letter was placed before him. The address on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the weight of it suggested that it was no ordinary correspondence. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he picked up the letter, sliding his finger along the edge before unfolding it carefully. The letter, written in an impeccable script, was brief but to the point. "Monsieur Poirot, I require your services urgently. A crime of a most delicate nature has occurred, one which I believe only someone of your particular abilities can resolve. I implore you to come at once. You will find me at the Rosedale estate in Hampshire, if the situation is grave. Yours sincerely, Evelyn Pembroke." Poirot sat back in his chair, the letter now resting on his desk before him. He allowed the words to settle in his mind, turning them over as he always did when faced with a new mystery. The name Evelyn Pembroke meant little to him, but the urgency in the message was clear. A delicate crime. That could mean anything, but Poirot knew one thing for certain. This was not a simple matter. The journey to Rosedale Estate. 2 days later, Poirot found himself traveling to Hampshire. The journey was uneventful save for the constant whirl of thoughts in his mind. What kind of crime would require his particular skill set? A delicate nature, he had been told. But how delicate? Was it a matter of subtlety? A financial crime, perhaps? Or was it something far more personal, more insidious? By the time Poirot arrived at the grand entrance to the Rosedale estate, the sun had begun to dip in the sky, casting long shadows across the pristine grounds. The estate was magnificent, an imposing manor house surrounded by sprawling gardens and thick, ancient trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Evelyn Pembroke was waiting for him at the door. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp features and a gaze that betrayed an intensity Poirot had learned to recognize. There was something about her presence, an aura of control, perhaps, or the weight of a secret she was desperate to share. The meeting with Evelyn Pembroke, Monsieur Poirot. Evelyn Pembroke greeted him with a cordial but firm handshake, her grip strong but calculated. "I am so grateful you've come. I will get straight to the point. A tragedy has occurred, and I fear the implications are far-reaching." Poirot studied her with the careful scrutiny he was known for. She was composed, almost too composed for someone claiming to be in distress. "You have my attention, madame," Poirot replied, his voice steady. "Please, tell me what has happened." Evelyn led him through the grand hall of the estate, a sprawling corridor lined with portraits of past generations of the Pembroke family. As they walked, she explained the nature of the crime. It had started with a theft, something seemingly small, insignificant even, but the consequences were far from trivial. A family heirloom, an ancient necklace of great value, had gone missing under strange circumstances. Evelyn herself had discovered its disappearance in the early hours of the morning, yet there was no sign of forced entry, no trace of a break-in. The odd part, however, was not just the theft itself, but the odd behavior of the household staff. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. And yet the necklace had vanished without a trace. The most troubling detail was a peculiar message left behind, scrawled in red ink on the floor of the library. "I see what you don't." Poirot's initial impressions. Poirot stopped walking, his mind whirring as he processed the details. A theft, a cryptic message, and no apparent motive. His little gray cells, as he liked to call them, were already at work. "You are sure of these facts, madame?" Poirot asked carefully. "There are no other explanations? No clues of any kind?" "None." "Monsieur Poirot," Evelyn replied, her voice tense. "I have searched every inch of the house. We've questioned the staff, and no one can explain it. There have been no signs of intrusion. Nothing. It's as though the necklace simply vanished into thin air." Poirot paused, considering the possibilities. He asked to see the library where the message had been found, and Evelyn led him up the grand staircase to a quiet, dimly lit room lined with bookshelves. It was here, in the center of the room, that the message had been written. Poirot bent down and examined the floor carefully. The letters were faint but still visible, and the red ink was striking against the polished wood of the floorboards. The message was clear. "I see what you don't. The first step in the investigation." "How long ago did you find this message?" Poirot asked, his eyes never leaving the cryptic writing. "Only this morning," Evelyn replied, her voice tight with frustration. "I don't know what to make of it. It's as if someone is mocking us." Poirot stood up, his mind already racing through the possibilities. A simple theft, or something more complex. Someone was playing a game, and Poirot's task was to determine who and why. The investigation would require more than just asking questions. Poirot knew that this was no ordinary case. There was something deeper at play here, something that would require his full attention. Evelyn Pembroke, standing by with a nervous air, watched Poirot carefully. "What do you believe, Monsieur Poirot? Can you solve this?" Poirot turned to face her, his expression calm but sharp. "I will, madame," he said, "but be warned. The truth is often more complicated than we expect. It will require patience, and it will require careful thought." Chapter 14. The Unseen Threat. The night had fallen as Poirot sat in the drawing-room of the Rosedale estate, his sharp eyes tracing the delicate lines of his steepled fingers. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and Evelyn Pembroke paced nervously before him. She had become less composed over the hours, her earlier stoic facade beginning to crack. Poirot, however, was calm, poised, his mind racing as he pieced together the fragments of the mystery. Evelyn had excused herself from the room earlier to summon the staff, an assortment of butlers, maids, and housekeepers who had each played a part in the estate's daily operations. They had been interrogated individually, but each had little to offer, and none appeared to have any clear knowledge of the whereabouts of the missing necklace. Poirot, ever the meticulous observer, had noticed one common thread between the testimonies: fear. Each person seemed frightened, not of the police, but of something more elusive, something that remained just beyond their comprehension. Now, in the silence of the darkening room, Poirot's thoughts turned back to the cryptic message left in the library. "I see what you don't." What did it mean? And who was watching? A conversation with the staff. The following day, Poirot requested to meet with the household staff again, this time in the privacy of the library where the message had been found. Evelyn stood at the door, watching with anxious eyes as Poirot conducted his questions with careful deliberation. First, he spoke with the head butler, Mr. Harrison, a man in his mid-50s with a stern but respectful demeanor. He had been the employee of the Pembroke family for over 20 years, and was known for his impeccable service. Poirot regarded him with interest, searching for any subtle indication of guilt or discomfort. Mr. Harrison's account was simple. He had been on duty the night before the theft, overseeing the household as usual. He'd entered the library around midnight to ensure all was in order, but claimed to have noticed nothing unusual. He described his routine as dull, the house quiet, except for the occasional murmur of the other staff. Poirot's keen eye caught the briefest flicker of hesitation in the butler's eyes when he mentioned the library, but there was nothing overt to indicate his involvement. Next, Poirot spoke with the maid, Miss Clara, a young woman in her 20s, whose appearance belied a nervous energy. Her responses were not as composed as Mr. Harrison's, and she seemed visibly uncomfortable under Poirot's unflinching gaze. "I don't know anything about the necklace, Mr. Poirot," Miss Clara stammered, fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "I didn't hear anything strange. Everything seemed normal." Poirot studied her closely, noticing the faintest reddening of her cheeks when she mentioned the normal. It was the kind of small detail that most would overlook, but Poirot had learned long ago to trust his instincts. There was more here. But what? He continued his questioning, systematically working his way through the rest of the staff, each interview revealing little more than surface details, Yet each person seemed to share one thing in common, an overwhelming fear of something they did not understand. The library reveals. Poirot returned to the library, standing once more over the floor, where the red ink had stained the wood. He crouched low, running his fingers gently along the grain of the floorboards. The faint, lingering scent of ink remained in the air, and Poirot's mind raced. There was something he was missing, something about the message itself. Why had the thief written those words in such a peculiar way? "I see what you don't." It wasn't just a taunt. It was a clue. His thoughts turned to the idea of perception. The thief was aware of something hidden in plain sight, something that everyone else had overlooked. What was it? Poirot stood up abruptly, his gaze sweeping the room once more, not with the intent of searching for physical evidence, but rather with the focus of understanding the psychology behind the act. The necklace, the message, the fear, these were all interconnected in a way he had yet to fully comprehend. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed. There, in the corner of the room, was a small, ornate mirror mounted on the wall. It had gone unnoticed in his previous inspections. Blending in with the rest of the room's rich furnishings, Poirot moved closer, his fingers brushing the edge of the glass. As he stood before the mirror, Poirot was struck by the odd angle in which it had been hung. It was not tilted in the way one would expect for a decorative piece. It was slightly off-center, as though it had been moved. Poirot's lips parted in realization. A hidden clue. The thief had been looking for something in the reflection. The message was not just a statement. It was a warning. "I see what you don't." The message had been written with the knowledge that the victim, Evelyn Pembroke, or someone else in the house, had overlooked something important. It was a clue that pointed to the mirror itself. Poirot carefully removed the mirror from the wall, checking for any signs of tampering. The frame creaked slightly as he adjusted it, revealing a small compartment hidden in the wall behind it. It was a secret panel, cleverly concealed, and within it lay an envelope. Poirot took the envelope carefully, his heart quickening as he opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper on which was written another message, this time in a different ink. Not everything is as it seems. This message was different, less cryptic, more direct, but it confirmed his suspicions. Someone was trying to manipulate the situation, using misdirection to confuse those who sought the truth. Confrontation with Evelyn Poirot wasted no time in finding Evelyn Pembroke, who had been anxiously awaiting his findings. She stood near the fireplace when Poirot entered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Madame," Poirot began, his voice calm but firm, "the situation is far more complex than it first appeared. There is someone in this house who wishes to deceive you." Evelyn's face paled as she listened to Poirot's revelation. She looked at him with wide eyes, clearly shocked. But who could it be? Who would want to hurt us like this? Poirot stepped closer, his gaze steady. "It is not a matter of hurting you, madame. It is a matter of manipulation. Someone has been using your fear to distract you from the truth." As Evelyn stood in silence, contemplating his words, Poirot's mind began to piece together the final fragments of the puzzle. He was close, closer than ever, to unmasking the one who had orchestrated this crime. Chapter 15. The Masked Truth. The air in the library of Rosedale Estate grew heavy with anticipation. As Poirot stood before Evelyn Pembroke, the envelope in her, his hand. The message within it was simple but telling. Not everything is as it seems. Evelyn, pale and anxious, was struggling to comprehend the implications of what Poirot had discovered. The room felt stifling, as though the walls themselves were closing in with the weight of the mystery. Poirot's voice broke the silence. calm and measured. "Madame Pembroke, the situation has shifted. The thief, or rather, the person behind this crime, is manipulating the circumstances to obscure the truth. The message left in the library, the disappearance of the necklace, and the strange behavior of the staff. All of these are pieces of a carefully crafted puzzle." Evelyn seemed almost in a trance, her mind racing to understand. "But who, Poirot? Who would want to do this to us?" Poirot regarded her carefully, his mind whirring. "The answer lies within this house, madame. Someone close to you, someone who knows the estate inside and out, is orchestrating this deception. But I believe the motive is not theft. No, it is something far more intricate." The hidden web Poirot spent the following hours revisiting the estate, retracing the steps of every person who had been in the house during the days leading up to the theft. He asked the staff about their movements, and although many appeared innocent, there was something in their eyes that suggested they were holding back. They knew more than they let on. Poirot's mind kept circling back to one particular detail: the fear. Each of the household staff seemed to have been influenced by an unseen force, an invisible hand guiding their actions. The feeling of dread in the air was palpable. But who had planted that seed? It wasn't just the staff who were involved. Poirot realized that the entire household was a carefully constructed web. Each person had a role to play, and every interaction, every gesture, was part of a larger plan. But what was the plan, and who stood to gain? Poirot returned to the library, his mind churning. The message behind the mirror was not just a warning. It was a signal, a way to point him towards something hidden in plain sight. The secret compartment, the envelope, it was as if someone wanted him to find it, to uncover the truth. The confrontation. Later that evening, Poirot summoned Evelyn to the library once more, her presence no longer one of mere curiosity, but of mounting desperation. She was growing increasingly anxious, and Poirot could sense her unease. "Madame, I have thought long and hard about this," Poirot began, his voice unwavering. "There is one person in this house who stands apart from the others, one individual whose presence has been curiously underplayed. It is time to reveal the truth." Evelyn looked at him, confused. "Who, Poirot? Who are you talking about?" Poirot's sharp gaze never left her as he spoke. "It is your brother, Edmund Pembroke." There was a long, stunned silence. "Edmund?" Evelyn whispered, as if the name had never crossed her mind before. "But Edmund is harmless. He's been ill for years." Poirot nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, the illness. How convenient. Edmund's health has kept him hidden in plain sight, hasn't it? No one suspects. Him, no one thinks to look closer. But the truth is, madame, Edmund has been playing a far deeper game than you realize." Evelyn's face was a mixture of shock and disbelief. "But he's never shown any sign of—" Poirot interrupted her gently. "He is not the man you believe him to be, madame. His illness has been a cover, a carefully maintained illusion. Edmund has been manipulating you, and he has been manipulating everyone in this house." Unmasking the scheme, Poirot's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He stepped closer, his voice soft but resolute. "Do you remember the necklace? The family heirloom that has been taken? Edmund has always known the value of that necklace, not just in monetary terms, but in emotional ones as well. It is tied to the family legacy, to something far more valuable than any diamond or gemstone. He knew that the necklace's disappearance would shake the foundation of the family, bring you all together, draw attention." Evelyn's eyes began to widen as Poirot's explanation took shape. "But why, Poirot? Why would he do such a thing?" Poirot's eyes softened, though his mind was as sharp as ever. Edmund's illness was never what it seemed. It was a ruse, a carefully calculated plan to play on your sympathy, to make you blind to his true intentions. His motives were not just financial, but psychological. He wanted control, he wanted power over the estate, and he knew that the only way to achieve that was by creating chaos, by making everyone distrust one another. Evelyn's voice quivered. "But how could I have not seen it? How could I have been so blind?" Poirot reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "It is not your fault, madame. Edmund used your love and your care for him to cloud your judgment. But now we have the evidence, the final revelation." Poirot turned to the desk in the corner of the library, where the envelope with the second message lay. The message was a final clue. Not everything is as it seems. Edmund's deception was not just in his actions, but in his very existence as you perceived it. He wanted to make you believe that he was incapable, that he was too frail to take any real action. Poirot looked back at Evelyn, but he was the one who planted the message behind the mirror. He wanted to make sure I discovered it, and he made sure that every step of this investigation would lead me to him. It was all a carefully orchestrated play. At that moment, the door to the library creaked open, and Edmund Pembroke entered. He was frail-looking, as Poirot had expected, a man who seemed almost too weak to stand on his own. But there was no mistaking the gleam in his eyes. He was the mastermind behind it all. Edmund gave a small, mocking bow as he faced Poirot. "I must admit, Poirot, you are more perceptive than I gave you credit for. I thought it would take longer for you to uncover the truth." Poirot stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Your game is over, Edmund. You can no longer hide behind your illness. The truth is clear to all now." Edmund's lips twisted into a smile. "Perhaps, Poirot, but remember, what is hidden is often the hardest to find." With those final words, Edmund's mask of fragility cracked. The true face of the criminal was revealed, and the mystery of the missing necklace was solved. Chapter 16. The Shattered Mask. The grand hall of the Rosedale estate was dimly lit by the flickering flames of the hearth. The remnants of the storm that had passed earlier left a chill in the air. Yet the atmosphere within the estate was far colder than the weather outside. Poirot stood before Evelyn Pembroke, his steely eyes fixed on her as Edmund had been escorted away. Evelyn sat in a chair by the fire, her face pale and drawn, her mind still struggling to come to terms with the shocking revelations of the evening. She had always known her brother Edmund to be fragile, to be someone who needed protection. But now she saw him for what he truly was, a master manipulator, a puppet master hiding behind the illusion of weakness. "Madam, I must ask," Poirot began, breaking the heavy silence. "Before we proceed further, is there anything you have not told me? Something that might shed more light on this situation?" Evelyn's hands trembled as she clasped them together in her lap. "No, Poirot," she whispered, shaking her head. "I've told you everything I know. I don't understand how I could have been so blind. Edmund, he was always there, always in need of my help. How could I have never seen through him?" Poirot's expression softened. "Madam, it is easy to be deceived by the face of those we love. Edmund played upon your compassion, and through that he created a false narrative. But now that the truth is out, we must look to the future." As Poirot's words hung in the air, there was a shift in the room. The shadows seemed to grow longer, as though the very walls of the estate were closing in on them. The tension was palpable, and Poirot knew that there was still more to unravel. Edmund's deception was just the surface, but it was far from the only mystery that needed to be solved. The mysterious letter. The next morning, Poirot returned to his study of the library. The letter that Edmund had left behind, hidden within the secret compartment behind the mirror, still weighed heavily on his mind. There was something peculiar about the phrase, "Not everything is as it seems." It seemed like a final challenge, a riddle that had not yet been solved. Poirot carefully examined the letter again, running his fingers over the edges. The paper was old, the ink faded in places, yet the message within was clear. As he studied it, a realization struck him. The wording of the message wasn't just cryptic. It was deliberate. It wasn't meant to confuse him, but to lead him towards something else. Suddenly, Poirot's eyes flickered towards the fireplace. There, nestled beneath the logs, he noticed something he had missed earlier. A small metallic object, gleaming faintly in the firelight. Without hesitation, he knelt and pulled it from the ashes. It was a locket, tarnished with age, but undeniably familiar. Poirot's heart quickened as he recognized the design. It was the same as the family crest on the necklace that had been stolen. A deeper layer of deception. Poirot's mind raced as he examined the locket. He knew it wasn't just a coincidence. Edmund's theft of the family heirloom had always felt too purposeful, too calculated, but this discovery, the locket hidden beneath the firewood, revealed that there was something far more sinister at play. He turned the locket over in his hands, noticing an engraving on the back. It was faint, but with careful scrutiny, Poirot was able to make out the letters E.P. His eyes widened. The initials matched those of Evelyn Pembroke. Could it be possible that the locket had once belonged to her? It was a strange coincidence, or perhaps it was more than that. Poirot's sharp mind began to piece together the layers of this mystery. The theft of the necklace, the message behind, the mirror, and now the discovery of the locket. All of these elements pointed towards something deeper. But what? Poirot knew that he needed to confront Evelyn once more. The locket, though mysterious, was the key to unraveling the entire scheme. He gathered his thoughts and made his way to the drawing room where Evelyn had been resting. Confronting the past, Evelyn stood by the window, looking out at the gloomy landscape beyond. Her face, once full of grace, now seemed hardened, weary from the events of the past few days. When she turned to face Poirot, there was a trace of uncertainty in her eyes. "Poirot, I don't know what else you expect me to say," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I told you everything I knew about Edmund. You've seen how he used me, how he manipulated me. What more is there to uncover?" Poirot stepped forward, holding out the tarnished locket. "Madame, I believe this belongs to you." Evelyn's face went white as she took the locket from Poirot's hand. Her fingers trembled as she turned it over, gazing at the engraving. How did you find this?" Poirot's eyes were steady as he spoke. "I found it hidden beneath the firewood, in the library. The question is, why was it hidden there? And why did Edmund go to such lengths to conceal it?" Evelyn's lips parted in shock. That locket was a gift from my mother. It's been in our family for generations, but I thought it had been lost years ago. When I was a child, I used to wear it all the time, but I haven't seen it in years." Poirot's brow furrowed, yet it was hidden, as though someone was trying to keep it from being discovered. "Edmund's theft of the necklace was not random, madame. He knew of the locket's significance, and he used it as part of his plan." Evelyn's voice trembled with the weight of the truth. But why? What did he want with it? What is the connection? Poirot took a deep breath. That is what I intend to uncover. I believe the locket holds the final piece of the puzzle. Edmund's obsession with your family's wealth and legacy went beyond the necklace. He wanted to control everything that you held dear. The locket was a symbol, a piece of the family's heritage that he sought to manipulate for his own purposes. The final revelation, Poirot's mind raced as he continued to piece together the puzzle. The theft of the necklace, the message behind the mirror, the hidden locket. All of these were steps in a carefully orchestrated plan. But the true motive behind Edmund's actions was still unclear. Evelyn looked up at Poirot, her face a mixture of despair and determination. Poirot, if there's something more to this, if there's more to Edmund's plan, I need to know. I can't rest until I understand it all. Poirot nodded, his mind finally finding the answer. Madame, Edmund was not just after wealth. He was after power. Power over the legacy, over the estate, over you. He wanted to dismantle everything that connected you to your family's past, and by doing so, he would have control over everything. But he underestimated you, Madame. He underestimated your strength. With that, Poirot's eyes hardened. And now, Madame, it is time for the truth to come to light. Edmund's game is over. Chapter 17. The Web of Lies Unraveled. The morning had dawned with an unsettling stillness. The silence within the Rosedale estate mirroring the turbulent storm of revelations that had shaken its foundations. Poirot paced in his study, his mind constantly whirring, piecing together the final moments of the puzzle. Evelyn's revelations had shifted the sands beneath his feet, but there were still unanswered questions, too many to leave things unresolved. As he sat at the desk, his hands folded with careful precision, the earlier discovery of the locket weighed heavily on him. It was a tangible symbol of the deeper, darker currents swirling within the Pembroke family. Edmund's motives had been far more complex than simply greed or revenge. They had been intricately woven into a tapestry of control, manipulation, and psychological warfare. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, and Poirot knew that time was growing short. Edmund's web of lies had been spun so tightly that it was nearly impossible to separate truth from fiction. Yet, Poirot was nothing if not persistent. Suddenly, a soft knock on the door broke his concentration. It was Hastings, looking every bit as worn from the tumultuous events as Poirot felt. "Poirot," Hastings said, his tone low. "There's something you should see." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "What is it, Hastings?" "It's about the letter, the one that Edmund left behind." Hastings continued. "I believe I may have found something that could be the final piece of the puzzle." Poirot's interest piqued. "Lead the way, mon ami." The hidden letter Hastings led Poirot to the drawing-room where Evelyn was sitting, her hands clasped nervously. She looked up at them as they entered, her face pale with anticipation. Poirot wasted no time in sitting down, his fingers gently stroking his mustache as he studied her expression. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice calm, "you mentioned the letter left behind by Edmund. What did you know of it?" Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for answers in the very walls. "I didn't think it would matter," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I never thought that it could hold any significance. But now," her eyes welled with tears, "now I realized that Edmund's words were not just a threat, but a key to everything. A key to what he had planned all along." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, Madame, but we must examine it closely. Every word, every symbol, Let us see what Hastings has discovered. Hastings stepped forward, a small envelope in his hands. It was hidden beneath the floorboards of Edmund's room. He explained, "I believe this letter is the one Poirot has been searching for." Poirot took the letter with careful hands, unfolding it gently. His eyes scanned the words, and a small smile crept onto his lips. The message was direct, but it held an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. The game is over, but the pieces remain. You can never undo what is already done, but you can try to stop it. Beware the one who smiles before he dies, for his smile hides the truth you cannot see. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he finished reading. He handed the letter back to Hastings and sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The message was clear now. Edmund had known his fate. He had known that the end was near, but he had smiled as though to mock them all, to leave behind one final riddle. What is the meaning of this smile? Poirot muttered to himself. Why the smile, Hastings? Why, I ask, did Edmund smile before he died? The smiling man, the phrase, the one who smiles before he dies, had lingered in Poirot's mind since he had first read the letter. It was not just a casual statement, it was a warning about Edmund's mindset in the moments before his death. Poirot's eyes flickered toward Evelyn, who was now visibly trembling. "Madame, do you recall any moment in Edmund's final days when he smiled, when he seemed to know something that the rest of us did not?" Evelyn bit her lip, thinking hard. "There was one moment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The night of the storm. I went to his room to speak with him. He was agitated, pacing back and forth. But then, when I entered, he stopped and smiled at me, an eerie, unsettling smile. He said, 'Everything is already in motion, Evelyn. There's no turning back now.'" Poirot nodded slowly, piecing the fragments of the puzzle together. The smile was not one of relief or comfort, but a knowing, almost mocking grin, one that suggested Edmund had orchestrated the events of his demise, had planned every move, and now, in his final moments, he was silently enjoying the chaos they had created. "There it is," Poirot murmured, a sense of clarity dawning on him. The smile before death was Edmund's way of showing us he had already won. He was never just a pawn in this game, madame. He was the one controlling the pieces all along. The final Tropero's deduction came in waves, each one bringing him closer to the heart of the mystery. Edmund had planned everything, from the theft of the necklace to the strategic placement of the locket. But more than that, he had played on the very emotions of the people closest to him. His manipulation of Evelyn had been central to his plan, but there had been a larger objective all along. Poirot turned to Hastings. "I believe we are nearing the end of our investigation, my friend, but there is still one question that remains unanswered. What was Edmund truly after?" Hastings raised an eyebrow. "You mean beyond money, Poirot? What could possibly explain all this madness?" Poirot stood up, a sense of finality in his movements. "It was never about the money, Hastings. It was about legacy. Edmund wanted control of the Pembroke estate, and he believed that by weaving this intricate web of deceit, he could erase his sister's claim to it. But in his arrogance, he underestimated one thing, Evelyn's strength." Evelyn looked at Poirot, her eyes wide with realization. "But how could he have known that I would fight back, that I would expose him? I had always been the one who sheltered him." Poirot smiled gently. "That, madame, was his fatal mistake. He misjudged your resilience. You were never the weak link he believed you to be. and now his machinations are unraveled. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and Poirot knew the next step was inevitable. The truth was laid bare before them, and it was only a matter of time before Edmund's treachery would be fully revealed to the authorities. The endgame Poirot turned to Evelyn. "Madame, I must now return to the authorities and present them with the full truth. The game is over." Evelyn nodded solemnly, her strength evident despite the tragedy that had befallen her family. "Thank you, Poirot. I don't know how I would have faced this without you." Poirot gave a small bow. "It is not I who should be thanked, madame. It is your courage that has brought us to this point. You are the true strength behind this family." As Poirot departed, his mind was already turning over the final steps. Edmund's plot had been complex, but in the end, it had been his own ego that had led to his downfall. The truth was now in the open, and justice would soon follow. Chapter 18. The Reckoning. The morning fog hung thick over Rosedale Estate as Poirot returned from the authorities' headquarters. He had relayed his findings, carefully outlining Edmund Pembroke's calculated crimes. Now, with the weight of the case off his shoulders, there was only one thing left to do: confront the truth that had haunted him for the past several days. As much as he had pried into the secrets of the Pembroke family, there was something gnawing at him, something he couldn't quite put into words. Poirot stood in front of the grand entrance of the estate, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Hastings approached with his usual air of concern. The two of them had grown accustomed to the twists and turns of the investigation, but even Poirot could not help but feel the finality of the moment. "Poirot," Hastings said, breaking the silence, "the estate is in chaos. The police have already begun their investigation. And Edmund, well, he's gone, but I can't help but feel uneasy. It seems so neat, too neat." Poirot smiled, his gaze steady and contemplative. "That, my dear Hastings, is exactly the reason I am not yet content. Edmund's plan may have been brilliant in its execution, but it was flawed in its foundation. There is something, I feel, that we have yet to uncover." Hastings's brow furrowed. "You're saying there's more to this?" Poirot turned to him, his expression sharp. "Indeed, Hastings, Edmund had all the pieces of a puzzle, but he overlooked one crucial detail: his own arrogance. The smiling man's legacy." As Poirot and Hastings walked through the grand halls of Rosedale Estate, Poirot's mind kept returning to the same question. What had driven Edmund to go so far? To orchestrate his own downfall, they arrived at the study, where Evelyn sat quietly by the window, gazing out over the gardens. Her demeanor was more composed now, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. She had been through so much, and yet she still held the weight of her brother's betrayal, the betrayal of her own blood. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice soft but firm, "I must ask you something. It concerns your brother's final actions." Evelyn turned, her eyes red from days of unshed tears. "What else could there be? You've already told me everything." Poirot studied her for a moment, noting the exhaustion on her face. "There is one more thing we must examine: Edmund's legacy. His manipulation went far beyond the theft and murder, had an agenda, and it was not simply for wealth. Edmund believed that by creating chaos, he could manipulate not only the people around him, but the very structure of the estate itself. He had something more in mind than just money." Evelyn frowned, confusion settling across her features. "But what could he have wanted? The estate will pass to me now. What more could he have hoped for?" Poirot walked to the fireplace, his mind still racing. "It was never about the money, madame. No, Edmund craved control. He believed that by putting everything into disarray, he would be able to force the Pembroke family into a position where they had no choice but to bow to him. He wanted power more than wealth, more than revenge. He wanted to erase the memory of your family's history. A web of influence, Poirot turned back toward Evelyn, his gaze intense. And that is where his plan failed. He underestimated your strength, madame. You are not a pawn in his game. You are the queen. Edmund failed to realize that in his desire for power, he alienated everyone around him. Why leave behind the letter, Poirot? Why all the cryptic messages? Poirot sighed, a slow, thoughtful expression crossing his face. The letter, Hastings, was his final act of control. Edmund had orchestrated his own death, knowing full well that his plan would eventually be exposed. But he wanted to make sure that his legacy, his influence, lived on. He wanted to ensure that his last moments were remembered. The smile, the letter. It was all a reflection of his need to remain in control, even in death. Evelyn's voice broke through the heavy silence. So he was trying to control me, even from beyond the grave. Poirot nodded, his tone grave. Exactly, madame. But his mistake was underestimating your resilience, your ability to fight back. He thought that you would crumble under the pressure of his machinations, but you did not. The final revelation, Poirot paced the room, his mind working furiously. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together, but there was still a lingering question. As much as he had uncovered about Edmund's motivations, there was still the matter of his death. Poirot turned to Evelyn once more. Madame, you must remember that Edmund was never alone in this. His scheming involved more than just the manipulation of the family. There were others who were involved, others who stood to gain from the chaos he created. Perhaps we have not fully uncovered all of his connections yet. Evelyn shook her head, bewildered. Who could possibly have been involved? Edmund had already isolated himself from everyone. Poirot's eyes narrowed. That is precisely what he wanted you to believe, madam. But in truth, he had allies, perhaps even one within your own circle. It is always the most unexpected individuals who are the true puppeteers behind the scenes. Hastings stepped forward, looking at Poirot in confusion. Are you suggesting there was someone else helping Edmund? Poirot paused, then nodded slowly. Yes, Hastings, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to their advantage, and someone who is still among us. The moment of truth, Poirot turned and addressed the room with renewed urgency. It is clear now. Edmund was not acting alone. Someone else was orchestrating events from the shadows. We must confront them before they escape, or worse, before they strike again. Evelyn gasped, her face pale. Who could it be, Poirot? Who? Poirot's eyes scanned the room, and a sudden realization struck him. His gaze settled on a who had remained quiet throughout their conversation. The butler, Mr. Gray. Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. The answer, madame, lies within your own household. The butler, Mr. Gray, has been playing a role far larger than anyone suspected. He was Edmund's accomplice, his ally in this game of deception. Mr. Gray was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Evelyn's face turned ashen, and she looked at Mr. Gray in shock. The butler's expression remained cold and unreadable, but Poirot could see the subtle tension in his posture. Mr. Gray stepped forward, his voice smooth but tinged with a hint of arrogance. So it seems the great Hercule Poirot has finally pieced it all together. Yes, I was involved, But it was never just about Edmund. It was about something much more valuable. Power. Influence. Poirot stepped toward him, his voice calm but firm. Your mistake, Mr. Gray, was underestimating the power of human nature. Edmund's plan may have been intricate, but it relied too much on deception and too little on understanding the people around him. And you, like Edmund, underestimated one person above all, Evelyn. The butler sneered. You think she can stop me now? It's too late for that. Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination. We shall see, monsieur. We shall see. Chapter 19. The Final Play. The quiet elegance of Rosedale Estate had been shattered. What was once a peaceful and picturesque family, home now echoed with the silent tension of suspicion and revelations. Poirot had orchestrated the final confrontation with Mr. Gray, the butler-turned-mastermind who had worked behind the scenes to aid Edmund Pembroke in his manipulation of the estate and his family. Yet, despite Poirot's assertions, there was still an unsettling sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. Evelyn Pembroke, though shaken, remained resolute. Poirot had not only unraveled the conspiracy behind her brother's final moments, but also exposed the web of deceit that had ensnared her household. The butler, Mr. Gray, had not simply been Edmund's accomplice, but a calculating figure who had hoped to seize control of the estate for himself. The sudden quiet that had settled in the room was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Hastings, ever faithful, appeared in the doorway, a determined look in his eyes. Poirot, I think we need to act quickly, Hastings said, his voice low. There's something strange happening, Gray's reaction. It's as if he's waiting for something, or someone. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. Indeed, Hastings, there is more to this than we initially believed. Mr. Gray may not be as defeated as he appears. We must be cautious. His game is not over. The plot unfolds. Poirot paced the room, the calculated rhythm of his footsteps punctuating the tense atmosphere. He could feel the subtle shift in the air, as though an invisible hand was pulling the strings of fate once again. Edmund Pembroke's death was the catalyst, but the true puzzle had yet to reveal itself. If Mr. Gray had been an accomplice, then the question remained, what was his ultimate goal? Poirot's mind, always sharp, turned over the possibilities. Edmund had wanted power, but Gray had been just as eager for it, if not more so. The true game had always been about control, the control of the Pembroke fortune, of the future of Rosedale Estate. It was about manipulating those around him to serve his own interests. Evelyn, who had stood quietly in the corner, looked up as Poirot stopped pacing and turned to her. Madame, he said softly, his eyes narrowing, there is one more thing you must understand. Mr. Gray did not just want to inherit the estate. No, he wanted to destroy everything that stood before him. Edmund's death was merely the first move in his larger plan. Evelyn blinked, confusion clouding her face. What do you mean, Poirot? How could Edmund's death be a part of Mr. Gray's plan? Poirot smiled, the edges of his lips curling into a knowing expression. Ah, that is where the true deception lies. You see, Mr. Gray was not acting alone. He had a backup plan, a final act that would secure his place as the sole authority in this house. The smile on Edmund's face was not just a final reflection of his twisted satisfaction. It was a signal, a clue to something far more insidious. Hastings stepped forward, a look of realization dawning on his face. You mean... Poirot nodded. Yes, Hastings. Mr. Gray wanted to frame someone for the murder. Not just anyone, but someone whose absence would create enough confusion to ensure his own ascension. You, madame, were the perfect target. Thought if you were implicated in the crime, the entire estate would fall into his hands. Evelyn took a step back, her hand instinctively rising to her mouth. But why me? Why would he want to frame me? Because you are the heir, Poirot replied, his voice unwavering. If you were caught, it would be much easier for Mr. Gray to manipulate the situation to his advantage. His ambition blinded him to the truth, that the family he sought to control would never fall to such an underhanded scheme. The last piece of the puzzle, Poirot's eyes gleamed as he turned to face Mr. Gray, who had remained eerily silent through the exchange. The butler, pale and cold, stared back at Poirot with a calm that bordered on arrogance. "You think you've won, don't you, Poirot?" Mr. Gray's voice was a low hiss. "But you're too late. This estate was always going to be mine. You were simply a distraction, someone to divert attention while I carried out my plan." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Ah, Monsieur Gray, you underestimate me. I knew from the moment I arrived that something was off. The pieces never fit, but it was your own pride that betrayed you. You thought yourself too clever, too untouchable, and that, monsieur, is where you made your mistake." Mr. Gray's lips curled into a sneer. "And what mistake is that, Poirot?" "The fact that I was going to inherit it all, that I was going to be the one to make this place truly mine." Poirot's voice remained measured. "No, monsieur, your mistake was underestimating the intelligence of a single individual, Evelyn. She would never allow you to manipulate her. And in trying to control her, you exposed yourself." For the first time, Mr. Gray's confidence faltered. His eyes flickered with uncertainty. "You don't understand. This was the only way. Edmund, he left me no choice." Poirot took a step forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You had a choice, Monsieur Gray. You always had a choice. But in choosing to deceive and manipulate, you sealed your fate. The final confrontation." At that moment, the door opened, and a team of uniformed officers stepped into the room. The leader, a stern-faced inspector, nodded to Poirot. "We have everything in place, Monsieur Poirot. Mr. Gray is under arrest for his involvement in the murder of Edmund Pembroke and the conspiracy to frame the heir." Evelyn looked at Poirot, her eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. "You did it. You exposed the truth." Poirot gave her a small, gracious smile. "It was not me, madame, but your own strength and determination that brought us to this point. You proved yourself to be the true heir, the rightful custodian of Rosedale Estate." With a last defiant glance toward Poirot, Mr. Gray was led out of the room, his fate sealed. Evelyn, though exhausted, finally allowed herself a breath of relief. The aftermath as the officers took Mr. Gray away, Poirot and Hastings remained in the study. Taking in the aftermath of the case, the tension had finally broken, and the estate once again seemed at peace. But Poirot could not help but reflect on the darker side of human nature, the lengths to which people would go for power and control. "Poirot," Hastings said, breaking his reverie, "what do you think will happen to Evelyn now?" Poirot turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Madame Pembroke is stronger than she realizes. She will carry on, and this estate will flourish once again. The true legacy of the Pembrokes lies not in wealth, but in character." Hastings nodded, his admiration for Poirot growing with each passing moment. "You've done it again, Poirot. Another brilliant deduction." Poirot smiled, the hint of satisfaction in his eyes. It is not about brilliance, mon ami, but about understanding the human mind. In the end, it is the mind that holds the key to every mystery. As Poirot prepared to leave, he cast one final glance over his shoulder. Evelyn, standing tall with her future ahead of her, seemed more at peace than she had in days. With a final nod to his companion, Poirot strode out of the room, ready for whatever mystery might cross his path. Wex, the quiet revelation that the winds of change had blown through the halls of Rosedale Estate, sweeping away the old, the corrupt, and the insidious plots of Mr. Gray. Yet, as Hercule Poirot stood on the doorstep of the grand mansion, the weight of his final reflection on the case felt heavier than any solution he had found before. Rosedale was no longer the same place it had been when he first arrived. The same shadows that had haunted the estate had been pushed back, and the remaining members of the household seemed more at ease, though the road to recovery would take time. Poirot had dealt with countless cases in his career, but each one left a mark on him, a reminder of the darkness in human nature that could so easily creep in when ambition and greed ruled. And yet, the delicate balance between light and dark was something Poirot knew all too well. With his hat in hand, he looked one last time toward the mansion before turning to his loyal companion, Captain Hastings, who had been by his side throughout this entire ordeal. The two of them stood in the stillness of the evening air, an unspoken understanding parting between them. Evelyn had taken her rightful place as the head of the estate, and the future of Rosedale was secured. But Poirot knew there were still loose threads, unanswered questions, and a lingering unease that seemed to hang over them all. "Poirot," Hastings began, his voice reflecting the tension that had been building since the arrest of Mr. Gray. "Do you think this is really over?" Poirot's eyes glinted with a knowing look, the twinkle of a mind always searching for the next puzzle. "Hastings, my friend, I do not believe that the game ever truly ends. There is always another layer to uncover, another twist to the tale. But for now, we have done our part. The criminals have been brought to justice, and the family is safe." Hastings looked thoughtful, but Poirot, I cannot shake the feeling that we missed something more, something that the case didn't quite explain. Poirot paused, his fingers gently tapping against the brim of his hat. "Ah, Hastings, you are ever so astute. There is, as always, a deeper layer to the story, a twist that remains unseen. You see, what Mr. Gray did not account for was the human heart." Hastings raised an eyebrow. "The human heart? But Poirot, you've solved the mystery. Gray is in custody, and Evelyn has the estate. What more is there?" Poirot turned to face him, a slight smile on his lips. "You must not think of this case as merely a puzzle of facts and lies. It was more than that. This was a battle of emotions, of human weakness, and ultimately of trust. Mr. Gray underestimated the bond of family, of loyalty." The words lingered in the air as Poirot and Hastings made their way down the driveway, the evening sun casting long shadows behind them. The estate, which had once been filled with suspicion and treachery, was now quiet. Only the distant chirping of birds disturbed the silence. "You see, Hastings," Poirot continued, "Mr. Gray believed that he could outwit everyone with his cunning, that he could control the situation by manipulating those around him, but he did not understand one crucial thing: the depth of connection that binds people together, even in the face of treachery. Evelyn may have had doubts about her place in the world, but she had the love and support of the people around her. and that gave her strength. Hastings nodded slowly. So you're saying that Grey's ultimate mistake wasn't just in trying to manipulate the estate, it was in underestimating the power of human connection? Precisely, Poirot said, his voice softening. He did not consider the true strength of the people who surrounded him. Their loyalty was far greater than any ambition he could harbor. That is why he failed. Hastings smiled, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. And that's why you were so confident from the start, Poirot. You knew that, no matter how clever Grey was, he could never predict the strength of the human spirit. Poirot smiled back, the warmth in his expression a stark contrast to the coolness of the evening air. Ah, Hastings, you see, it is not always about the evidence. It is about understanding the nature of people, their fears, their desires, and their need to protect what they hold dear. A farewell of sorts, as the two men made their way to the car. The serenity of the estate behind them seemed to hold a quiet dignity, as though the house itself was finally at peace. Evelyn had taken control, and her strength would carry the Pembroke legacy forward. Poirot, however, was not one for lingering sentiment. He had done his job, unraveling the threads of deception and revealing the truth. But there was no time to bask in the satisfaction of a job well done. For him, the next case was always just around the corner. "I think, Hastings," Poirot said with a thoughtful glance toward his companion, "we will find our next mystery soon enough. The world is full of puzzles, and I cannot resist a good challenge." Hastings laughed, a chuckle filled with affection for his companion. "I think I'll start looking forward to the next one, Poirot. You never know what kind of trouble you'll land us in next." Poirot's gaze turned to the horizon, where the first stars of the evening began to appear, twinkling like tiny mysteries waiting to be solved. "Ah, my friend, trouble is just another word for opportunity, and opportunity, in the end, is what keeps us moving forward." With that, Poirot adjusted his coat, gave a final nod to Rosedale Estate, and turned to his companion with that familiar gleam in his eye. "Onward, Hastings! The next mystery awaits." And with that, the two detectives drove off into the night. The quiet revelation of their final victory settled between them like a well-worn coat, comforting, familiar, but always ready for the next adventure. The end.